Hi guys, tonight we begin with you standing at the edge of a world that looks nothing like your warm bedroom. You step onto a frontier plain wrapped in white, the kind of white that does not sparkle politely, but swallows everything, even the horizon. Snow curls round your boots as if it wants to claim you, whispering that you probably will not survive this if you are foolish enough to treat it like a scenic backdrop. The wind roars across the empty land, carrying the dry frozen scent of sagebrush and chimney soot from some distant homestead you cannot quite see. The night ahead is long, the temperatures drop faster than your phone battery on a winter morning, and yet people once slept through this on purpose. They built lives here, they made beds here, they dreamed here. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you feel like sharing, tell me your location and the local time right now. It is always fun to know where in the world you're listening from. Now dim the lights and let the cold frontier night surround you. The snowstorm hits you before the sentence is even finished. You feel it in the air the way sound gets muffled into soft cotton. The only noise left is your own breathing, that slow, foggy pulse you make as you trudge forward. You don't know where you're going, not exactly, but you are moving the same way. Thousands of people moved across this land in the 19th century. Some came for gold, some came for cheap land. Some came because they were told the West was the place you could reinvent your life with nothing more than a wagon, a shovel, and unreasonable optimism. A mainstream fact floats in with the wind. By the 1880s, nearly 500,000 settlers had already planted themselves across these territories. They were out here long before electric lights, long before reliable forecasts, long before any sensible person would have said, "Sure, let us sleep through a blizzard in a half-built house." Yet they did it anyway. You push deeper into the storm and feel your eyelashes stiffen. The flakes come sideways, your coat crackles with ice. You pull it tighter, though it does not help much. The frontier version of insulation was not scientific. It was, well, whatever people could get their hands on. Scraps of wool, rabbit pelts, repaired coats handed down through so many siblings that the original colour has become a rumour. Historians still argue whether families truly believed these makeshift layers were enough or if they simply accepted the cold the way you accept taxes or unskippable ads. A necessary annoyance that you try not to think too hard about. Somewhere up ahead a faint glow pulses behind the snow. A lamp maybe. A window. A place with walls. You angle toward it, your boots crunching loudly even through the muffling blanket. The snow swirls up around your legs like a living creature trying to hug you into submission. You keep walking. Frontier people always kept walking. They had to. Stopping meant freezing. As you get closer to the light, another detail drifts into your mind, one of those fringe facts that feels too weird to be true, but has shown up in enough diaries to make you pause. Some settlers believed that sleeping with a chunk of warmed rock under the covers could prevent nightmares on storm nights. Not because of the heat, because they thought malevolent spirits hated stones. You shake your head gently at that one, but you also kind of get it. When a storm this big surrounds your house and rattles the windows all night, you will take any superstition that lets you fall asleep. You approach the lamplit silhouette. A little cabin half buried in white drifts. Before you reach the door, you stop and listen. The wind moans along the wooden walls. The roof crackles under its icy load. You wonder if the people inside are awake. Maybe they're all lying in bed, eyes wide open, watching puffs of frost drift from their own breath. Maybe they're staying completely still, because any movement risks letting a draft creep under their blankets. You knock. Your fist meets cold wood softened by years of storms. The door groans open. Warmth hits your face instantly, not the lush heat of modern radiators, but the kind of wavering warmth a small fire can offer in a room that is doing its best. You step into a world of dim yellow light and the smell of melting snow on old floorboards. A family looks up from their blankets. They do not seem startled. Travellers in storms were not surprises in this era. They were hazards you welcomed because turning someone away could doom them. You close the door behind you, shutting out the roaring wind like someone clicking mute on a violent soundtrack. Inside, everything feels slow. You can hear the fire pop in the iron stove. You can hear someone shift on a straw-stuffed mattress that rustles like dried grass. You can hear your heartbeat speeding down from the sprint of the storm into the calmer pace of survival. No one speaks for a moment. It is not awkward. It is the quiet of people who have learned that talking wastes energy the body might need later. Your eyes adjust to the space. You notice how tight it is, how the furniture is arranged to block the most notorious draft spots, how thick quilts drape over every surface. The ceiling beams glitter with frost. You realize there is no escaping winter here. People did not avoid the cold. They slept inside it, fought it shape themselves around it. You settle near the stove, peeling off layers stiff with frozen snow. The heat prickles your skin as feeling returns in tiny, painful stabs. You can imagine the nightly routine this family performs, checking the fire, tucking blankets under their feet, eyeballing the windows for any new cracks, wondering if the roof can hold another hour of snowfall. Their version of bedtime was never just bedtime, it was defense. Someone hands you a mug. Not tea, not coffee, just hot water, as simple as it gets. But it feels luxurious, almost decadent in this place. You cradle it in both hands and let the warmth seep into your fingers. The steam rises into the dim cabin air and softens the noises of the storm. You breathe in, slow, the way the land forces you to breathe. Whether you meant to or not, you have begun to adapt to the pace of the frontier, a place that demanded you be patient, vigilant, and ready to sleep lightly through the worst nights. The fire flickers, the storm growls, and you settle deeper into the narrative, letting the cold night of the Wild West wrap around you like a story you're not just hearing, but living. You wake slowly, feeling the weight of the night pressed against the walls. The storm outside has not stopped. It has only settled into a steadier rhythm, the steady kind that hints it might last for days. You sit up and notice the way the cabin air feels different now, warmer at the level of your chest, yet still icy near the floor. Your toes curl instinctively. Cold in a frontier home is not a visitor. It is a permanent roommate who never pays rent, whispers all night, and steals heat whenever it wants. When you step outside again, the world has changed completely. Snowdrifts stretch as high as your shoulders. The horizon has vanished into a blank sheet of white. Your breath trails behind you like a tiny ghost as you push toward the next homestead. The next little bubble of survival on this enormous frozen plain. You want to know how people endured these storms night after night, how they managed to find sleep inside something that looks determined to crush them. So you start walking toward a mound of earth that at first glance looks like a hill but is actually a house, a sod house. Sod houses were the desperate and brilliant answer settlers created when wood was scarce. A mainstream historical fact floats into your thoughts as you step toward it. By the early 1870s, entire counties on the Great Plains had less than 10% tree coverage, which meant many families had no choice but to build their homes straight from the ground. They sliced thick blocks of prairie turf roots, and all stacking them like chocolate cake slices into walls that could reach a stunning 2 or 3 feet thick. The result was not elegant. The result was functional. In storms like this, function meant everything. You approach the sod house and place your palm on the outer wall. It is dense and cold, but it has a firmness that feels strangely alive. The roots that once clung to soil now cling to each other, forming a natural insulation. The smell drifting from it is earthy and slightly damp, like the scent that rises when you open a bag of potting soil. You inhale. It feels grounding, as if the land itself is reminding you that it has its own way of caring for those who live on it. When you duck through the low doorway, the interior greets you with an immediate hush. Sod houses have a kind of muffled quiet that even modern insulation cannot imitate. Every sound becomes soft around the edges. You hear the crackle of a small fire. You hear the gentle shifting of blankets. You hear your own footsteps in a deeper, more resonant way. It feels like entering a cave, one shaped by human hands but softened by the earth. The family inside glances up at you and you nod back, stepping to one side so the cold outside cannot slip in too quickly. They return to their tasks with a smoothness that suggests they have spent many nights doing the same thing. A mother patches a quilt by lantern light. A teenage boy trims kindling. Two younger children sit close together on a bed frame made of rough boards, their blanket pulled up to their noses. A quirky little detail drifts into the air as you settle in. Some sod house families used to hang pieces of old carpet, or even pages torn from newspapers on their interior walls, not just for insulation but to keep insects from falling out of the dirt ceiling and dropping into their hair at night. You look up at the shadowed roof and smile faintly. Nothing like the threat of a surprise beetle to keep bedtime interesting. You run your fingers across the wall. The texture is uneven, gritty and cool. It has the firmness of stone but the scent of soil. When a wind gust hits the exterior, the whole house shivers slightly, not in a brittle way, but the way a sleeping animal adjusts its breathing. The walls absorb the sound of the storm, turning the violent outside world into a steady heartbeat. No wonder people could sleep in places like this. The house felt like a shelter in the deepest sense. It was not built on the land. It was part of it. A scholarly debate ripples into your thoughts. Historians still argue whether sod houses were warmer in winter than log cabins, or simply felt warmer because settlers perceived anything earth-built as solid and comforting. No one agrees. The records contradict each other. Some diaries insist sod houses were snug havens. Others claim they were leaky, buggy and damp. Standing here now, you can see how both could be true. Comfort in the frontier was a flexible concept. People often convinced themselves they were warm because the alternative was panic. The fire in the small iron stove glows with a copper light. You move closer and let your hands drift above the warmth. The heat is modest, more suggestion than guarantee, but it fills the space in a slow, patient way. Everything in a sod house happens slowly. Heat spreads slowly. Conversations rise slowly. Snow on your boots melts slowly. Even fear moves at a slower pace perhaps, because the house itself encourages stillness. You sit on the edge of a bedding platform covered in hand-stitched quilts. The quilts are thick, but patched so many times they resemble topographical maps. Each piece of fabric carries its own history. A scrap from a dress, a scrap from a flour sack, a scrap from the lining of a winter coat someone outgrew 3 years ago. You run your fingers over them, feeling the stitches, the bumps, the tiny ridges where repairs met repairs. The mother glances up from her sewing and gives you a small smile. Not a cheerful smile, not a tired one, but a simple acknowledgement that you exist and the storm exists, and everyone here is doing their best to coexist with both. You feel the temperature of the floor through your boots. It is shockingly cold, the kind of cold that climbs your legs if you stay still too long. That is why beds and benches are raised. Heat rises, and in a sod house every inch counts. You stretch your legs and feel the warmth slowly creep upward. If you were a 19th century homesteader, you would already be thinking about how to survive the night. Would the wind shift and send snow through the doorway cracks? Would the children stay covered? Would the fire hold until dawn? Sleep was never just sleep. It was an agreement between you, your home, and the sky. Someone places a pot of something warm near the stove. Maybe beans, maybe porridge, maybe something made from dried apples saved for these bitter months. The smell is faint but comforting. You watch steam drift into the dim golden air. It blurs the lantern light, turning the room into a soft watercolour. You close your eyes for a moment, letting yourself feel the steady pulse of the house around you. The storm outside continues to roar, but in here it feels distant, as if the walls are humming a lullaby made out of dirt, roots and resilience. You breathe in, breathe out, and sink deeper into the rhythm of the frontier night. The storm is still raging, but you are inside the earth now, wrapped in soil warmth and the quiet determination of people who built their sleep straight from the land. You leave the sod house behind as morning light filters through a sky still packed with storm clouds. The air hits your face with that sharp metallic cold that makes your teeth ache. You pull your coat close, your breath drifting ahead of you like a tiny fog signal, and you begin walking toward a shape on the horizon that stands taller and cleaner than the rounded mound of a sod home. Straight lines, dark logs, a thin ribbon of smoke twisting upward, a log cabin. Your boots sink into snow that is both powdery and crunchy, the strange mix created when new snowfall lands on older packed drifts. The smell of pine rides the wind crisp and almost sweet, as if the forest wants to remind you that nature is not only unforgiving, it can be generous too if you know how to ask. Frontier families asked by chopping down trees until their arms shook and their breath steamed the winter air. They stack those trees into walls, sealing the seams with anything sticky enough to stop a breeze. As you approach the cabin, you notice the small details first. The snow is piled halfway up the sides, making the building look half buried. The gaps between the logs shine with a pale mixture of clay straw and maybe even hair. Yes, hair. A quirky tidbit wiggles into your thoughts. Some settlers used animal hair, or even handfuls of their own cut hair for chinking when the clay supply was low, believing it added strength. Imagine sitting there while someone trims your hair not for fashion but for insulation. You reach out and brush your fingers along one of the logs. It is deeply grooved from age and wind, polished smooth by decades of storms scraping against it. The surface feels cold but sturdy, like a backbone meant to hold up against everything the sky throws down. A mainstream historical fact eases into your mind. By the mid-19th century, log cabins had become iconic symbols of frontier endurance, with families often raising an entire cabin in a single day through community barn-raising style teamwork. Neighbours would gather tools in hand and lift logs together, racing daylight. You step up onto the narrow porch. Snow creaks under your weight. You push open the door and a rush of warm, smoky air washes over you like an embrace. The scent of burning pine mixes with damp wool, old wood, and a hint of something cooking slowly in a pot. The light inside is dim but golden, cast by a lantern that sways slightly in the draught. Your eyes adjust and you see them, a family bent over their evening preparations. They do not flinch when you enter. Out here, visitors blown in by storms are part of the rhythm of winter. The cabin interior feels tighter than the sod house, but brighter. Light bounces off the log walls, creating soft shadows that stretch across the floor. You notice how carefully the cracks between the logs have been packed. A smooth layer of clay pressed by fingers, then dusted with fine powder. Around the windows, strips of cloth have been nailed up to block the cold. Some of the cloth looks suspiciously like pieces of an old shirt. On the western wall, a coat hangs so stiff with frost it could probably stand up on its own. Wood pops in the cast-iron stove, sending sparks dancing like restless fireflies. The heat spreads in the slow, stubborn way of all frontier warmth, moving outward in small circles rather than filling the whole cabin at once. You walk closer, holding your hands out, feeling your skin tingle as life returns to your fingertips. Someone slides over a wooden stool for you. You sit, feeling the roughness of the seat through your clothes. The father of the family stands near the window, pressing a wad of moss into a tiny gap where daylight peeks through. Moss, another common chinking material. You watch him work with steady, practiced movements. He knows exactly how much pressure to use, how much soft clay to smear over it, how to test it with his fingertips. This is not home improvement. This is survival craftsmanship. A scholarly debate drifts into your thoughts. Historians still argue whether settlers learned these insulation tricks from indigenous tribes or developed them independently as they adapted to the environment. No one has the full answer, but the techniques resemble many long-standing indigenous building methods, and you can feel the shared wisdom in the way these walls breathe and hold heat. You glance around the cabin. The floor is rough plank wood, worn down from boots chores, and 1,000 small struggles. The loft above holds a narrow mattress of pine boughs, straw, and whatever spare fabric the family could gather. The smell of evergreen hovers faintly from it, a reminder of warmer seasons. 2 children peek at you from the corner, wrapped together under a thick blanket. Their noses are pink, but they look warm and content, tapping their mittened hands together in some silent game. The mother ladles something from the pot into small bowls. A kind of stew, maybe beans with bits of pork. The fragrance spreads through the room, settling over you like a comforting haze. You realise how deeply smell shapes the memory of nights like this. Wood smoke, stew, damp wool. cold air slipping around the edges of blankets. These scents form the lullabies of the frontier. As you eat a small portion offered to you, the weight of the storm outside presses faintly against the building. The wind makes the cabin creak in long, low tones. The sound is not frightening. It is steady, predictable, almost rhythmic. You can imagine lying in a bed here, listening to the timbers shift, the logs settling, and the storm breathing around you like some large animal testing the walls. The father sits down with his own bowl and nods toward the stove. You understand the unspoken message. That stove is the heart of the night. It cannot be left alone. Fires in these cabins were not decorative touches. They were life support systems. If the fire died during a snowstorm, the cold would creep in faster than anyone could wake. So families developed a routine. Someone always checked the stove before bed. Someone often woke up midway through the night to feed it again. You look at the log walls and the ceiling materials and understand the combined effort at play. The logs block the wind. The clay fills the cracks. The moss plugs the sneaky gaps. The stove holds the warmth. The quilts trap it around the bodies sleeping beneath them. Everything works together. Everything must. You shift on your stool, feeling a pleasant heaviness in your limbs. The air inside the cabin is warm enough to soften your thoughts. You breathe in the pine-scented heat and let your eyelids drift lower. The mother places her sewing aside. The children settle beneath their blanket. The father stands one last time to check the stove. You can almost feel the rhythm of their nightly ritual polished by hundreds of storms and thousands of freezing nights. You lean back, feeling the log wall behind you. It is cold but solid. Reliable. A partner in survival. And as the storm murmurs outside, you realize the truth. People did not just sleep through snowstorms in the Wild West. They slept with them. They slept inside the noise, the pressure, the trembling walls. They learned to trust the materials around them. They shaped their sleep with clay moss pine fire and grit. You glance toward the door. Snow presses heavily against it from the outside, but the cabin holds firm. Warmth gathers around your body. Your breathing slows, and you sink a little deeper into this frontier night surrounded by logs that have withstood 100 storms and will likely withstand 100 more. You step back into the cold, leaving the steady glow of the log cabin behind you. The moment the door closes, the storm steals your warmth with greedy fingers. Snowflakes sting your cheeks like tiny sparks as you move through the deep drifts, heading toward the next pocket of human endurance on this frozen prairie. A cluster of shapes rises ahead low and rounded, with smoke slipping through small openings in the roofs. You're walking toward a homestead known for something very specific, something heavy, warm, and a little wild-smelling. Buffalo robes. Before you even reach the door, the scent hits you. A deep musk, earthy and thick, mixed with the cold tang of snow. It is not unpleasant, but it is undeniably animal. You push aside a hanging quilt and step inside a dim, cramped room, where a family sits under blankets so large and dense they look like melted mountains. They lift one edge and motion for you to join, and when you slide beneath the massive hide, the first thing you notice is the weight. It is like sinking under a warm living shadow. Thick fur presses against your neck, coarse yet comforting. The inner leather layer holds heat with surprising skill. As you settle in, a clear historical note surfaces in your mind. Period records from traders and soldiers show that buffalo robes were considered the single most effective winter bedding available on the plains, prized for their ability to trap body heat, even in temperatures cold enough to freeze spilled water before it could hit the floor. You stretch your legs beneath the robe, feeling the warmth gather around you like a slow sunrise. The family shifts to make space, and the hide adjusts with them its heavy folds, moving like a great weighted blanket centuries ahead of its time. The sensation is grounding, almost hypnotic. You understand instantly why people trusted these robes during the worst storms. They were not just bedding, they were allies. The father sits close to the fire, turning a roasting stick in careful motions. His boots steam. His coat drips melted frost onto the packed dirt floor. He glances at you with a half smile and taps the buffalo robe with one finger, as if to say that this thing is the true heater, not the fire. And he is not wrong. You feel the heat radiating back at you, your own warmth, multiplied by the dense fur. A peculiar detail pops into your thoughts, one preserved in a few diary entries that frontier collectors love to quote. Some settlers swore that if you shook a buffalo robe too vigorously before bed, a tiny flurry of dust and old hair would drift out like a snowstorm inside your house. They treated it almost like a ritual, a strange indoor weather event. You glance at the robe wrapped around you and imagine someone giving it a shake, so forceful it creates its own miniature blizzard. Not exactly a chore you would volunteer for, but you understand the habit. These hides were used daily, slept under nightly, and dragged across countless miles. They carried the frontier in every fibre. The storm outside groans louder, pressing against the walls until a thin line of snow filters through a crack above the doorframe. The mother rises, plugs the gap with a rag and pats it twice as if soothing a restless animal. Then she returns to her spot, pulling the robe higher around her shoulders. The children huddle at her side, sharing heat under a smaller hide that looks softer, its fur brushed smooth by years of use. You notice how close everyone sits. Not because space is scarce, though it certainly is, but because warmth is more dependable when bodies gather. Under the robe, you can feel the subtle shift each time someone breathes. The air grows humid with shared breath and fire smoke. It feels enclosed in a way that is strangely comforting, like hiding inside the fur of a giant creature while the storm prowls outside. You let your shoulders relax. The robe sinks heavier over your chest. Across the room, a bundle of dried herbs hangs from the ceiling. The scent drifts lightly through the air, adding a hint of sage to the musky warmth beneath the robe. A fragment of frontier wisdom emerges in your thoughts. Some families hung herbs not for cooking, but because they believed the scent kept away lingering winter illnesses, especially the coughs that spread quickly in cold months. There is no telling whether the belief held any medical truth, but the fragrance softens the heavy air and makes the space feel gentler. At the far end of the room, the father adjusts a draftboard beside the window. A sliver of cold air grazes your cheek before he seals the gap again. And here another unresolved question from historians comes to mind. Some researchers still puzzle over whether buffalo robes were used more as sleeping covers or as insulation draped over doorways and windows during severe storms. Accounts conflict. Some settlers insisted they slept beneath them nightly. Others claim they preferred wool quilts and reserved their buffalo hides for plugging drafts. Standing here now, wrapped tightly in one, you can imagine both options. The robes are so thick and warm they could do either job without complaint. You shift slightly, and the robe adjusts with a slow, heavy wave. The softness beneath your fingertips reminds you that buffalo were once the lifeblood of the plains. Clothing, bedding tools, shelter patches, even fuel on desperate nights, when dried dung became the only thing that would burn. You picture the herds that roamed freely across these lands before settlement exploded. Then you think about how sharply their numbers collapsed by the 1880s. A sobering fact one settlers rarely acknowledged while pulling these hides up to their chins on winter nights. The fire crackles. The children begin to drift towards sleep, their eyes blinking slower, their heads drooping against their parents. The warmth expands under the robe, turning the cold world into a fading memory. The storm outside hurls its icy breath at the walls, but in here you feel untouched, cocooned in a layer of hide thicker than your arm. You can hear your own heartbeat softened by the fur around your ears. One of the children mumbles something about the wind sounding like a hungry wolf. The mother strokes their hair and whispers that storms only sound fierce when the walls are strong. You let that settle in your mind. Storms do not frighten people who know their shelters can hold. You lean back and close your eyes for a moment. The darkness beneath the robe feels safe. A world within a world. You imagine frontier nights when entire families slept under a single robe, breathing in unison, wrapped in warmth, while the wind carved icy ridges outside. It must have felt like being hidden inside the heartbeat of the prairie itself. The robe grows heavier as you relax. The fire pops again. The father draws the hide further over his shoulders and lowers his voice. The room settles into that familiar frontier, quiet, the kind shaped not by silence, but by soft, steady living. A pot simmers, a lantern hums, snow hits the roof in gentle thumps, and you inch deeper into the warmth, letting the robe swallow every trace of cold left in your bones. You step back into the cold again, the heavy warmth of the buffalo robe still clinging faintly to your skin. The storm has quieted, not because it has weakened, but because the world has simply grown used to its presence. Snowdrifts twist like lazy ghosts across the open prairie, rising and falling in slow spirals. You pull your collar higher, feeling the sting of wind against your neck, and head toward a squat cabin, whose chimney leaks a thin ribbon of smoke. The closer you get, the clearer a soft glow becomes through the frosted window. Nightwear. Frontier's nightwear. A small detail, but one that shaped how people held on to warmth long after the fires dimmed. You step inside, brushing snow from your shoulders. A family is preparing for bed, their movements tired but methodical, almost ritualistic. The fire is down to glowing coals, sending out a quiet heat that flickers across the worn wooden floor. The first thing you notice is the clothing. Simple, practical, and surprisingly expressive. A young woman stands near the hearth, pulling on a flannel nightshirt that falls nearly to her ankles. The fabric is thick and slightly stiff, dyed in faded checks that once were bright reds and blues. Period letters and shipping records reveal a consistent truth here. Flannel was one of the most sought-after winter textiles across the frontier because it trapped heat, even when slightly damp, and could be patched endlessly. You can see why. The garment looks sturdy enough to withstand the storm itself. A child runs past you, bundled in a nightgown so big it trails behind them like a cape. The hem is patched with worn flower sack fabric, stitched together with mismatched thread. The child giggles, trips, then stands, and tugs the nightgown back into place with practiced hands. It strikes you that bedtime clothing was not just clothing. It was armour against the cold. Then your eyes land on something more peculiar. A knitted nightcap draped over a bedpost, the kind that curls at the end like a little wizard's hat. You pick it up and feel its soft wool between your fingers. The mother glances over and chuckles. She explains that the cap keeps ears from freezing during the night, especially in lofts where roofs frost from the inside. That prompts a memory from your readings. An offbeat frontier testimony once described waking to find your breath frozen in your own hair, tiny crystals forming wherever warm air touched cold fabric. You set the nightcap back gently, suddenly grateful for modern heating. On the far side of the room, the father pulls off his boots and steps into thick wool stockings that reach almost to his knees. He pats them proudly. Not every family had them. Some relied on foot wraps. Others slept wearing their daytime socks stiff with frost. But wool stockings, if you could afford or knit them, were a prized possession. A lesser-known oddity stirs in your mind as you watch him wiggle his toes. A few prairie families believed that sprinkling a pinch of warm ashes inside stockings before bed helped prevent chilblains. The logic made sense in a frontier sort of way. Warmth was warmth. Ash was what you had. The children begin to yawn. The mother guides them toward the bedding, her night wrap rustling softly as she moves. You observe how each family member prepares differently, yet all share the same goal: to protect as much body heat as possible before lying down. Frontier nights were unforgiving. Even minor drafts could freeze fingers or toes by morning. You sit near the fire, warming your hands, while the father tightens the ties on his long woolen nightshirt. As he bends forward, you see how the fabric has been mended again and again, little squares of patchwork forming a faint mosaic across the chest. Frontier nightwear was never discarded lightly. It aged with the family season after season, earning its place in the bedtime routine. The woman hangs a kettle of hot water near the fire, letting steam rise into the cool air. She tells you that warm steam helps keep the throat from drying out on winter nights. Then she hands you a cup of water heated just enough to warm your stomach without wasting fuel. The steam curls upward like a pale ribbon. A slow moment settles over the room. The children whisper under their blankets. The father rubs his hands together, preparing to settle down. The mother plats her hair so it does not turn into stiff, icy knots by morning. You watch her fingers work nimble and efficient. It is clear she has done this every night of every winter. Her braid falls neatly down her back, long enough to tuck into her night wrap. You take a sip of the warm water. It tastes faintly of iron from the kettle, but the heat spreads soothingly through your chest. Experts today still cannot agree on one aspect of frontier sleepwear. Some believe families wore every layer they owned to bed-piling shirts over sweaters over coats. Others argue that wearing too much could restrict circulation, making people colder, not warmer. Diary entries strike both tones. Some families slept bundled like overstuffed dolls. Others swore by minimal layering, relying instead on blankets for insulation. You can see evidence for both here. The parents wear moderate layers. The children look like soft fabric-wrapped cocoons. The mother moves through the room, dimming lanterns one wick at a time. Shadows rise up the walls. The storm outside pushes against the windows with a soft rhythmic sound. You settle back, feeling your muscles relax into the quiet. Someone hands you a night wrap, a simple cotton piece meant to be tied around the shoulders. The fabric smells faintly of wood smoke and lye soap. You drape it around yourself and feel its warmth immediately. Not hot, not heavy. Just a steady barrier between you and the drifting cold. The family begins to nestle into their resting places. The father settles near the fire, his feet wrapped in layers. The mother tucks the children beneath quilts so thick they ripple like small hills. The room darkens until only the orange glow of the coals remains. You listen to the soft rustle of fabric, the quiet breaths, the subtle shift of blankets. Everything about this moment is shaped by clothing. The nightshirts, the socks, the wraps, the hats. They form the first shield against the cold long before blankets take over. You pull the night wrap closer to your chest. Outside, the storm whispers across the roof. Inside, the family drifts into sleep wrapped in the practical softness of frontier nightwear. And you let yourself drift with them, settling into this slow warm hush that holds the night at bay. You step out of the nightwear-filled warmth of the small cabin and back into the freezing dark where snow hisses softly across the packed drifts. The storm is still alive, still hungry, still pressing its cold breath into every gap it can find. You tighten your coat and begin walking toward the faint glow of another homestead, this one sending up a thicker plume of smoke than the others. That is your destination now, a place where iron and fire rule the night, a place where the stove never truly sleeps. The closer you get, the more you feel the heat radiating from the chimney. It pulses gently through the cold air, a promise of warmth waiting inside. When you push the door open, a wave of smoky heat rushes at you with a force that almost startles. The interior is dim, golden, and loud with the quiet music of burning wood. You hear crackles, low pops, the faint whistle of air being pulled through vents. It feels like stepping into the heart of the storm rather than away from it. The family inside barely notices your arrival at first. They are busy tending the stove with the exactness of people caring for something alive. The mother wipes the door with a strip of cloth, removing soot so she can watch the embers. The father crouches low, adjusting the damper with the slow patience of experience. One child sits on a small stool, feeding tiny twigs in one by one, mesmerized by the glow. You make your way toward the iron stove. It is bulky and black, studded with bolts and shaped with curves that look both elegant and industrial. As you get closer, a firmly established detail from frontier life rises in your thoughts. Cast iron stoves revolutionized winter survival in the West, making it possible for families to heat entire homes with far less wood and far more efficiency than open hearths ever allowed. You can see why. This stove radiates heat in every direction. It fills the room, climbing up your legs, warming your face until it tingles. The father looks up and greets you with a nod, then taps the top of the stove with one knuckle. He explains that keeping a stove alive requires constant attention. Too many logs and it overheats, cracking the iron. Too few and it dwindles to a low red whisper. The damper must be adjusted for storms, then readjusted once the winds shift. He talks the way a sailor might talk about handling sails during a gale. The stove is his vessel through the winter. You lower yourself onto a bench near the wall, feeling the warmth seep through the wood. The room smells like burning pine wet wool lard from cooking pans. and faint traces of smoke that cling to every surface. It is the scent of survival. It is the scent families here grew up with so completely that many adults later claim they felt uneasy in rooms without it. Something catches your eye, a smooth stone about the size of a grapefruit resting near the stove on a folded rag. The mother lifts it gently with a cloth and places it beneath a quilt on the bed. You blink at the simple act. A small peculiarity preserved in old journals resurfaces. Many households used heated stones to warm beds before lying down, placing them under blankets to chase the icy chill from straw mattresses. Sometimes they even wrapped stones in rags and held them against their torsos to fall asleep faster. Primitive maybe, effective absolutely. The stone warms the bed almost instantly. You can see a faint steam rise from the quilt. The children giggle and crawl over to press their hands against it. The steam curls like a ghost fleeing the cold. Outside, the storm hits the wall with a deep thud. Snow falls heavily from the roof with an audible slide. Wind worms its way into cracks, making thin whistling sounds. The father listens carefully, head tilted. Then he stands and adds another log to the fire. The moment the log touches the embers, flames leap up in bright orange ribbons. The heat intensifies, and the shadows in the room grow softer. A lingering academic question drifts through your thoughts. Some researchers still wonder how families balance their fuel supplies during relentless winters. Diaries describe both abundance and desperation. Some homesteads had entire sheds of seasoned logs ready for storms. Others ran dangerously low by midwinter, forced to burn dried corn stalks, twisted hay, or even furniture scraps to keep the fire alive. There is no single answer. Every family fought the cold in their own way. You watch the flames through the small window in the stove door. They dance and coil like living creatures. The clink of metal expanding and contracting fills the room. The heat is so strong now that you feel your skin prickling even through your layers. The mother opens a window flap for a moment to let a bit of fresh air in, then quickly closes it before the cold can gain ground. The contrast is sharp and startling. The father settles into a rocking chair, eyes half closed but still alert. He will not sleep deeply tonight. Someone must wake every couple of hours to check the fire. Letting it die during a storm this fierce would be dangerous, even deadly. The children lie down on their straw-filled mattress, their small bodies curling instinctively toward each other. The youngest grips the warmed stone under the covers. His face relaxes. His breathing deepens. You run your hand along the stovepipe. It hums with heat vibrating faintly. The warmth radiates through the whole room. You imagine how many nights families have gathered around a stove like this, telling stories, sewing, mending, praying, hoping the storm would pass before their firewood ran out. The stove was not just a tool, it was the guardian of the night. As you sit there, the heat eases your shoulders. Your eyelids grow heavy. The fire crackles in a rhythm that feels almost like a heartbeat. Outside, the wind howls, but feels distant, powerless against the fortress of iron and flame inside. You breathe in the warmth and let it settle deep into your bones. The room dims. The family sinks into quiet stillness. The stove continues its steady work, filling the night with a gentle roar, and you rest beside it, wrapped in its glow, drifting slowly into the peaceful warmth that only a fire fed through a storm can create. You step back outside the warmth of the ever-burning stove, fading from your skin almost instantly. The storm seems to sense your exit and greets you with a fresh push of icy wind that nearly steals your breath. Snow clings to your eyelashes as you move through the swirling white, heading toward a small outbuilding lit from within by a faint lantern glow. As you approach, you notice the way the building leans slightly to the left, as though exhausted from years of bracing against storms like this one. When you push the door open, what you find inside surprises you. Not a family settling in for the night, but a group of adults taking turns staying awake. Their eyes look tired, their cheeks flushed from the heat of the nearby fire, and a pot of coffee sits on a crate half frozen around the edges. They nod at you in greeting, their movements slow, careful, burdened by the weight of sleepless nights. This is a household practicing something very common in the early frontier winters, rotating sleep shifts. You settle onto a wooden bench, watching as one man stands, stretches, and hands another his place near the fire. The transition is so natural, so well rehearsed, that it feels like watching a practiced dance. One reliable detail from surviving letters explains that many families divided the night into rotations during severe storms, so someone would always be awake to guard the fire, tend to livestock emergencies, or shovel out drifting snow before it sealed the house shut completely. The stakes of winter demanded vigilance, and this little room shows how calmly these people accepted that role. A woman lifts the coffee pot, examines the icy layer forming on the handle, and laughs quietly. She pours you a cup, warning that it is more slush than drink. You take a sip anyway. The taste is sharp, bitter, and strangely comforting. It wakes you up, nudging your senses forward into the cold night. The man nearest the door adjusts his coat and opens it a crack to check on the storm. The blast of cold that enters is so fierce, it sends a ripple through the group. He closes the door quickly and bars it again. His breath trembles as he steps away. You understand why these shifts matter. A single mistake in a night like this could cost the entire homestead dearly. You look around the room and notice a large board leaning against the wall. It is covered in chalk marks, names ours small symbols. One woman sees you examining it and explains that each mark represents a shift. Some households like to use beads or carved notches on a stick instead, but chalk worked well when the room stayed dry. It is not just record keeping, it is reassurance. Proof that everyone does their part to carry the night. A small boy sleeps curled up on a cot in the corner, wrapped in a quilt so thick it resembles a cocoon. His mother rests beside him but does not lie down. She sits upright, eyes half closed, her hand resting on the quilt as if she can sense warmth through the fabric. Many accounts from the era mention mothers who slept only in short bursts during winter storms, unwilling to sink too deeply into rest, when the elements outside felt unpredictable. Watching her now, you can see how such habits form. The cold demands alertness. It asks for sacrifices. One woman stands and begins to stir a pot over the fire. The scent of hot milk and a sprinkle of cinnamon wafts through the room, softening the sharpness of the storm outside. She places the pot back onto the stones with practiced gentleness. A little-known detail from a scattered collection of family notes reveals that some frontier families believed giving warm milk to the person taking the coldest shift kept their spirits strong and prevented the dizziness caused by long nights without sleep. Whether it worked or not, the gesture still feels tender in the dim orange light. A man in a wool cap leans over to inspect a stack of firewood. He picks up one log, weighs it in his hand, and places it beside the stove. Then another, and another. You can hear the faint thunk of wood hitting the floor. His gestures are slow but precise. Firewatch is not glamorous. It is repetitive. It is taxing. It is essential. He sits down and glances at the window where frost blooms across the glass in branching, delicate patterns. Interpretations vary widely among historians when it comes to whether these frost traces held symbolic meaning for settlers. Some believe they were nothing more than familiar winter sights. Others argue that families sometimes treated certain frost shapes as warnings or omens about the coming night. Sitting here now, watching the faint light shimmer across those frozen lines, you can imagine how easily people might read significance into them. The woman cooking milk hands you a wooden cup filled with the warm mixture. The heat moves through your chest like a gentle ember. Around you, several others sip quietly, shoulders, drooping heads tilting. They look like people preparing for a long vigil. Even the fire seems subdued, burning steadily rather than brightly, its glow deepening into a low red pulse. Outside, the storm shifts suddenly. A blast of wind slams into the side of the outbuilding, rattling the boards hard enough to make you flinch. Snow dust drifts down from the ceiling beams. One man stands immediately checking the hinges and pressing his palm against the window frame to ensure no new draft has opened. The group watches him carefully, waiting. When he nods, they relax again. You can feel the tension in the air, softened but not vanquished by the warmth of the stove. The sense of responsibility hangs heavy. Someone must continue to watch. Someone must stay awake. The woman who's been sitting beside her sleeping child finally closes her eyes for a moment. Her breathing steadies, her head dips forward. You wonder how long she's been awake. Hours likely, maybe more. Fatigue shows in the slow blink of every adult in the room. The man with the chalkboard stands and marks another line. He calls softly for the next person. A younger man rises, shrugging off his blanket, and takes his place at the fire. He presses fresh kindling into the coals until a new wave of flames curls upward, lighting his face in warm gold. He squints into the brightness, then settles in with the rigid posture of someone fighting sleep. You wrap your arms around yourself, feeling the weight of the night settle on your shoulders. The storm outside snarls and growls like a restless animal, but the people here hold their ground. They breathe with the rhythm of duty, not fear. And as you watch them trade, places share warmth, sip slushy coffee and keep attentive eyes on the fire, you realise that survival in the West was not always about dramatic battles or rugged individualism. Sometimes it was about staying awake when everyone else needed to sleep. You close your eyes for a moment, listening to the subtle chorus of crackling firewood, the low hum of breath, the soft scrape of a chalk mark on the board. Sleep shifts are quiet work. They require stamina, patience, and faith that the next person will honour their part when their turn comes. And as the storm continues its cold assault outside, you sit among these weary guardians of the night, letting their steady vigilance guide you deeper into the heart of the frontier winter. You leave the shift watchers behind, stepping once more into a world where the storm shapes every breath you take. Snow curls around your boots in spiralling waves, soft but relentless, and the wind whistles across the open land like a distant flute. You walk toward a cluster of shapes barely visible in the haze, low rectangles, humped silhouettes, the faint outline of a roof sagging under the snow's weight. These are the places where people lay their exhausted bodies each night, beds stuffed with straw feathers or whatever the land could spare. Tonight you seek out those humble sleeping platforms, the so-called ticks and feather beds that carried frontier families through countless winters. You push open a door and step inside a cabin glowing with soft lantern light. The warmth hits your face gently, not as forceful as the stove you visited earlier, but steady. The room smells like dried grass, faint smoke, and cold wood beginning to thaw. Your eyes adjust, settling on two beds pushed against opposite walls. They look simple at first glance, but as you step closer, the details emerge. One bed is filled with straw. You can see the pale golden stalks through a few small tears in the fabric, little whispers of the prairie poking out like reminders of the world beyond the walls. A practical fact preserved in household inventories tells you that straw ticks were the most common type of bedding for ordinary settlers, especially in regions where feathers were rare or expensive. Straw was everywhere. Straw was free. Straw was replaced seasonally or sooner if mice claimed it first. You reach out and press your palm against the mattress. The surface rustles softly. It gives beneath your hand, but in a way that lacks the cushion modern beds provide. There is a firmness, almost a stubborn quality, as if the mattress itself has weathered the storm alongside the family. A woman nearby laughs when she sees you testing it. She walks over and drops onto the straw tick with surprising grace. The mattress sighs under her weight, releasing that unmistakable scent of dried grass. She explains that straw keeps you warm when it is fresh, but once it compresses, the cold starts climbing from the floor straight through your bones. That is when you shake it out or restuff it. A chore she claims to have done more times than she can count. On the other side of the room, the second bed looks softer, fuller shaped like a gentle hill beneath its quilt. You sit on the edge, and it welcomes you with a slow, sinking embrace. This one is a feather bed rare enough that it signals a little more comfort, maybe a little more money, or simply a family skilled at making use of every bird they hunted. First-hand accounts from travelling salesmen recorded that featherbeds were often prized heirlooms, passed from mother to daughter, with some beds containing feathers plucked by generations of hands. You sink deeper, feeling how the feathers shift. They rustle in a way that almost mimics breath stirring softly beneath the quilt. The sensation is soothing and slightly unstable. You imagine someone rolling over in their sleep and the whole bed lifting a few inches like a billowing cloud. A small girl sits beside you proudly telling you that her grandmother started collecting feathers for this bed when she was only 15. She runs her hands over the quilt, smoothing it with slow strokes. The quilt itself is patched in 100 colours and textures, a rainbow made from scraps of old skirts, flour sack prints, and pieces of shirts worn thin by labour. She pulls the edge up to your chin, demonstrating how quickly it traps warmth. And indeed you feel heat gather around your shoulders almost instantly, as if the quilt were whispering to you to stay still, stay safe, stay asleep. Across the room a man shakes out another straw tick. You watch the golden strands rise into the air in a small cloud, then settle. A curious little mention from one traveller's journal comes to mind. Some families mixed dried herbs into their straw to soften the scent or ward off insects. Lavender if they had it. Sage if they did not. A few even sprinkled dried mint leaves to keep the mattress smelling fresh on storm nights. You inhale subtly, and yes, you pick up a faint herbal fragrance near the shaken bed. The woman who settled onto the straw mattress stretches her legs and taps the edge of the bed with her heel. She tells you that children usually slept in the straw ticks because they were lighter and bounced less, while older family members preferred feather beds whenever they had enough feathers saved. But children did not mind. The rustling of straw reminded them of summer fields, a memory that kept them warm in ways blankets alone could not. You look around the room and notice how the beds are positioned. Both are raised slightly off the floor on wooden frames, a practical necessity in rooms where icy air pools at ground level. You step nearer the edge of the straw tick and feel the cold draft swirling along the floorboards. The bed height is not luxury. It is survival. A man near the stove explains that bedding often required maintenance even during the night. If the straw compressed too much, it was common to punch the mattress with your fists, or roll it up and beat it outdoors once the storm eased. Sometimes someone would even get up in the night to shift the filling around. He laughs and admits that more than once he woke to find himself lying in a hollow that dipped so low it felt like sleeping in a small ditch. You smile, imagining that odd sensation. It is easy to picture the nightly routines of these families, shaking, flipping, adjusting, patching. Beds were not passive objects. They needed care. They shaped sleep as much as the quilts above them. The girl tugs your sleeve and leads you to the corner where spare straw sits in a burlap sack. You run your hand through it. The strands whisper against your fingers, light and dry. She tells you that this is good straw, the kind from clean wheat fields, not filled with dust or brittle fragments. Her pride is unmistakable. Straw was not glamorous, but it was essential. Meanwhile, the feather bed beside you shifts slightly as someone sits down on its far edge. The feathers redistribute in small waves, sending a faint ripple through the mattress. Interpretations among bedding historians differ on whether feather beds truly provided more warmth, or merely felt warmer due to their softness. Some argue their loft trapped more air. Others claim straw was equally warm when freshly filled. But sitting here now, wrapped in the quilt, you feel the featherbed cradle your spine in a way straw simply cannot. Softness itself becomes a kind of heat. You slide off the bed and stand between the two mattresses. The storm outside seems miles away. Inside, warmth pools deeply around each bed, radiating from the quilts and lingering in the spaces where bodies will soon settle. The soft light flickers over the straw's golden edges. A faint hum of feathers shifting drifts through the air. You watch the family prepare for sleep. The girl crawls into the feather bed and nestles down until the quilt covers her chin. Her tiny sigh melts into the quiet. The woman on the straw tick adjusts her pillow, which is not filled with feathers but with scraps of worn fabric rolled tightly together. She settles in, laying one hand on her chest. You lower yourself onto a small stool, letting the hush of the bedding settle around you, the rustle of straw, the sigh of feathers, the gentle breathing of a room that has endured countless winter nights just like this one. You can almost feel the beds themselves holding the memories of storms past, shaped by every sleeper who curled into their warmth and trusted them to guard the night. And as you sit there, you drift deeper into the gentle rise and fall of these humble mattresses, letting their simplicity and their warmth wrap around you like another layer against the cold. You step back into the storm, your boots sinking deep into snow that seems to swallow sound itself. The wind hums against your ears low and hollow, like someone blowing across the mouth of a bottle. As you trudge forward, you notice a warm, flickering glow in the distance, not the steady orange of a stove or the bright white of lantern light, but something softer. It draws you in the way a bakery window might draw a traveller on a cold city street today. You follow the scent before you truly see the building. Cinnamon, rendered fat, wood smoke, and beneath it all that unmistakable fragrance of winter kitchens. You push open a door that creaks with frost and warm air hits you instantly. The change is so sudden your eyes water. Inside the kitchen radiates a rich mix of aromas that envelops you like a thick quilt. In the centre sits a wide hearth, its fire glowing under a heavy iron pot suspended from a hook. Heat rises from it in velvety waves. Around the room, shelves line the walls filled with jars, sacks, and wooden bowls that hold the small comforts of frontier life. The family inside gathers close to the hearth, some already preparing for sleep on pallets spread out across the kitchen floor. You see blankets stacked there, quilts folded neatly, little slippers arranged by the door. The kitchen, more than any other room, holds the warmest air in the house. That is why so many people slept here on storm nights. One fact mentioned often in household records shows that frontier families treated the kitchen as their winter bedroom when weather turned vicious and the hearth became the true centre of nighttime life. Your boots thaw, leaving tiny puddles near the door. The mother of the household gestures for you to come closer, handing you a cup of something steaming. It is not tea or coffee, but hot broth, rich and savoury. You sip it and warmth spreads across your chest as if someone lit a small fire inside you. On a low bench near the hearth, a boy pulls apart a loaf of bread so fresh it steams in the cool air. He offers you a piece without looking up, dipping his own into the warm broth. The aroma of the bread mingles with the scent of drying herbs that hang from the rafters. Thyme, rosemary, maybe sage. The air feels almost edible. Your gaze drifts to a set of small iron skillets resting near the wall. Their surfaces gleam with a sheen that comes from decades of use. The father explains that they keep them by the hearth not only for cooking, but because a warm skillet placed near the feet before sleep can help chase off the cold. A quiet, seldom discussed trick mentioned in a few homestead diaries. Not a common solution, but one that made nights like this more bearable. A girl sits on a small stool, her hands wrapped around a mug. She hums softly, the sound barely rising above the crackle of the fire. The tune is simple, repetitive, calming. Her siblings lie down on blankets nearby, already adjusting to the idea of sleeping next to the heat source that keeps the kitchen alive. Above the hearth hangs a row of drying apples. Their sweet concentrated aroma warms the air in gentle waves. A few flutter slightly each time the fire flares. You imagine how the smell must comfort everyone settling down around you. Many frontier journals mention that the scent of cooked or preserved food drifting through the house made long winter nights feel safer, almost luxurious even when rations were limited. You step closer to the hearth, feeling the warmth roll over your cheeks. Your hands tingle pleasantly. The fire crackles, sending little sparks of light across the floor. You realise that kitchens like this were more than places to prepare meals. They were sanctuaries. Warmth radiated from the fireplace into the bones of the house. People slept near it not only for comfort, but because doing so increased their chances of waking up alive. A woman lifts the lid from a pot, releasing a cloud of steam, thick with the fragrance of onions, fat, and a hint of pepper. She stirs slowly, the wooden spoon scraping gently against the iron. Interpretations among culinary historians differ about what exactly frontier winter kitchens smelled like most often. Some argue lard and dried meat dominated the air. Others believe smoke and wet wool were more prevalent. Standing here now, breathing in all these scents layered together, you realise it was probably all of them at once. A tapestry woven from whatever each family could gather, preserve or keep warm. The father sets a warmed stone at the foot of one of the pallets. The little ones cheer. The stone glows faintly, radiating heat through the quilt that covers it. You smile, thinking back to the heated bedstones you encountered earlier. But here in the kitchen, everything smells better, feels softer. The warmth is not just physical, it is emotional. A curious little kitchen habit surfaces in your mind, one mentioned in a few old recipe notes. Some families sprinkled a pinch of flour on the hearth before bed. If the flour browned too quickly, they believed the fire was running too hot. If it stayed pale too long, the fire was too low and the family risked waking up freezing. The mother does just that now, tapping a little flour onto a stone near the coals. She studies it, briefly nods and adds a log. You settle onto a stool, listening to the low murmur of conversation. The room glows in soft tones of orange and brown, the fire reflecting off the tin cups and pots hanging on the wall. Everything seems to pulse in time with the crackling logs. One child has already drifted off to sleep, curled up against a sack of flour that doubles as a pillow. Another clutches a wooden spoon as if it were a toy. The smell of the hearth seeps into the air around them, a scent that will become part of their memories long after storms like this fade. As the fire steadies, the family begins to quiet. Blankets rustle. Someone gently nudges the broth pot closer to the ashes to keep it warm. A kettle whistles briefly, then calms. The mother dims the lantern, leaving the hearth as the room's lone source of light. You lean back and breathe deeply. Warm bread, simmered broth, dried herbs, smoke. These are the scents of survival in winter. These are the notes that lull people into sleep even as storms rage outside. Your shoulders loosen. Your breathing slows. The kitchen hums around you, a living cradle of heat and scent. And as you sink deeper into the warmth, you realize that sleeping here in the heart of the home was not just a practical choice. It was a comfort that reached the soul. The storm continues outside, unbothered and unbroken. But in this kitchen, protected by firelight and fragrance, it feels very far away. You step back into the storm once more, the heat of the kitchen fading behind you, until it becomes only a memory at the edge of your skin. Snow stings your cheeks in tiny sharp bursts, and the wind drags long ribbons of cold air across your neck. You pull your collar tighter, squinting into the blinding white. Somewhere ahead, barely visible through the shifting curtain of snow, you see the dim outline of several cabins clustered together. Their roofs sag under the weight of drifts. Their chimneys send up weary threads of smoke. These are not isolated homesteads tonight. They are neighbours drawn together by necessity. You walk toward the cluster, your boots sinking deep. When you reach the nearest door, a knock, it opens quickly, as though the people inside were waiting for someone. Warmth rushes out to greet you, pulling you into a room that is already filled with bodies, blankets, and the low murmur of shared survival. The first thing you notice is how many people are here. Entire families, perhaps 2 or 3 households gathered shoulder to shoulder. Some sit on benches pushed together, others stretch out on the floor using saddlebags as pillows. You spot a little one asleep inside a wash basin padded with quilts. The room feels crowded but calm, like a large animal curled around its young. One firmly rooted observation from the period indicates that during the worst blizzards, neighbours often combined homes for warmth and safety, especially if one house had a stronger stove or more dependable insulation. It was a practical strategy, and it added a layer of comfort that lone cabins could not offer. People in the cold West learned early that winter was best faced together. A woman near the hearth scoots aside to make room for you. She wraps her shawl tighter around her shoulders and smiles through chapped lips. Her hair still glistens with melted snowflakes. Nearby, another woman ladles stew into wooden bowls, passing them around with a gentle efficiency. You accept one gratefully. The steam curls upward in soft swirls. The broth is rich with root vegetables, and the warmth spreads across your chest like a slow tide. On a small table sits a plate of biscuits, slightly hard from age but still edible. A man breaks one in half and dips it into a stew, explaining that everyone contributes something when they gather like this. Food, wood, blankets, stories. No one arrives empty-handed, even if all they bring is another body to radiate heat in the room. You sit down near a group of children bundled together under a patchwork quilt. Their giggles ripple through the air as they play a quiet hand game. One taps your knee and shows you a carved wooden figurine shaped like a prancing horse. The smooth grooves in the wood tell you it has been handled, often perhaps passed from sibling to sibling through many winters. As you breathe in the thick warm air, a curious little footnote from a settler's memoir drifts into your thoughts. Some families believed that sleeping in groups not only provided warmth, but also reduced the likelihood of nightmares during storms, as though the collective presence kept the mind anchored. You glance around at the relaxed faces, the light laughter, the easy conversation, and you feel a flicker of understanding. Isolation breeds fear. Company melts it. Near the hearth, two men lean close to examine the stove. One shifts the iron plate, slightly adjusting the airflow. The other tests a crack in the stovepipe with his finger and nods satisfied. They work in silence, but with the camaraderie of people who have done this 100 nights before. The fire pulses in deep oranges and reds, and you can feel its warmth from across the room. There is a spot against the far wall where several quilts hang like tapestries. Their colours dim in the lantern light, but the patterns shine through stars, diamonds, winding paths. One quilt in particular draws your eye. Dark blue squares stitched with pale thread. You ask about it, and an older woman explains that each square represents a month her parents survived after moving west. A tally of endurance sewn into fabric. She fingers the edge gently as if greeting an old friend. Around you, people begin to settle more fully. Boots are loosened, scarves untied, mittens placed near the hearth to dry. Someone tunes a fiddle, the strings humming softly. Then a quiet melody drifts into the air, rising and falling like a slow breath. The sound fills the cabin in gentle waves, smoothing the rough edges of the storm outside. Interpretations among rural historians differ over whether these gatherings were prearranged or spontaneous. Some argue communities planned them during early winter, marking whose home would serve as the storm refuge. Others believe people simply followed instinct, trusting that doors would open when knocks came in the night. Listening to the easy flow of voices around you, you suspect both were true. Planning and instinct often worked hand in hand out here. The stew pot empties. The lantern dims. A small baby fusses briefly, then calms as someone rocks the cradle gently. You watch blankets shift as people settle into comfortable shapes. Pallets are rearranged. Quilts are shared. A young man even offers his jacket to an elderly neighbour, draping it over her feet. As the fiddle tune slows, conversation softens until only a few whispers linger. The fire continues its slow-breathing rhythm, casting warm shadows across the crowded room. The heat is thick now, held in place by the sheer number of bodies gathered together. You feel yourself relaxing, your muscles loosening under the layered warmth. The closeness of the group brings a sense of safety, a feeling of being wrapped inside a living shield. Even the storm seems gentler when you face it like this, surrounded by people who collectively refuse to let the night win. Someone nudges you, offering space on a quilted pallet. You settle in, gratefully stretching your legs beneath the warmth. A soft hand tucks the quilt around your shoulders. You inhale slowly, letting the comforting sense of stew smoke wool and human presence fill your senses. The wind outside murmurs against the walls, but in here, wrapped in shared warmth and quiet companionship, you feel sheltered, protected, steady. You close your eyes and let the hush of neighbourly breathing lull you towards sleep. This is not just survival. This is community. This is the frontier at its gentlest. And as you listen to the fading fiddle notes, you drift deeper into the warmth of a night held together by people who refuse to face the storm alone. You step back into the storm again, leaving behind the crowded warmth of the neighbour-filled cabin. The night grabs you immediately, its cold fingertips slipping down your collar, its breath swirling around your legs. Snow ripples across the ground in long sheets, gleaming faintly in the moonlight that fights its way through the thick clouds. Ahead of you stretches open land. No fences, no lanterns, no chimneys, just miles of snow and wind. Perfect country for the people you're about to join, the cattlemen who slept under skies that did not care whether they woke up again. You follow the faint outline of a trail, your boots slipping on frozen ridges. In the distance, you see the dim glow of a campfire, a small trembling star in the vast dark. As you approach, figures emerge from the swirling snow. Wrapped in heavy coats and oilskin slickers, they look like dark silhouettes carved from the night itself. A cowboy tips his hat to you, his breath puffing out in pale gusts. You step closer to the fire, feeling its heat tug at your skin in irregular bursts. Sparks leap upward into the storm, glowing fiercely for a second before the wind swallows them. Around the fire lie bedrolls spread across the snowy ground. Thick tarps, woolen blankets, worn canvas. You stare at them, surprised by how thin they appear, and one cowboy catches your expression. He laughs softly, the sound dry and tired. Travel diaries from the era consistently reveal that cowboys slept outdoors in nearly every season, even during brutal blizzards relying on little more than layered canvas, a sheepskin lining, and whichever side of the fire happened to radiate heat. The cowboy closest to you sits on a saddle turned upside down. It serves as his pillow, his nightstand, and sometimes his makeshift windbreak. The saddle creaks as he shifts, adjusting his blanket. You notice how his fingers tremble, not from fear, just from cold that never fully leaves. Another cowboy walks past, leading a horse whose breath billows out like steam from a locomotive. The animal shakes its mane, tossing a spray of ice crystals into the air. The man checks its hooves, pats its neck, and murmurs something low. Then he returns to the fire, rubbing his hands together briskly. The wind howls louder for a moment, pushing the flames sideways. One of the men pulls out a small tin cup and fills it with hot coffee from the pot suspended above the fire. He hands it to you with a grin. The liquid is so bitter it nearly stings your tongue, but the warmth spreads through your chest like a slow, smouldering ember. You notice frost forming along the rim of the cup, even as the coffee steams. That is the kind of cold you're dealing with. A curious frontier note recorded in a cowhand's recollection surfaces in your mind. Some cattlemen rubbed bacon grease on their faces before lying down, believing it protected their skin from cracking and freezing wind. You glance around. You half wonder if anyone here has done that tonight. It is hard to tell under all the dust and frost. As the storm thickens, the cowboys begin preparing for sleep. They unroll their bedrolls, spreading canvas over snow that crunches loudly beneath their boots. They check their slickers. They tug their hats low over their faces. The firelight flickers over their movements, making them look like ghosts sliding into place. One of them explains that the rule for sleeping out here is simple. Keep your feet dry, your head covered, and your back toward the wind. Anything else is luck. Letters preserved from cattle drives point out that cowboys sometimes slept in groups during the worst weather, lining their bedrolls side by side so their shared body heat could create a small island of warmth in a freezing plain. You can imagine the difference that makes. Out here, even a few degrees matter. A horse nickers softly in the background. The herd stands close together, their bodies forming a windbreak of steaming silhouettes. The cowboys glance toward them, often their instincts tuned to detect any shift in the animal's behaviour. They watch the cattle for signs of panic, signs of drifting signs that the storm might push them into a deadly stampede. Even when trying to sleep, the cowboys listen. You crouch beside one of the bedrolls. The cowboy demonstrates how he folds the outer canvas layer tightly around his boots and coat, sealing out as much snow as possible. Inside, a wool blanket waits scratchy but warm. Some even line their bedrolls with dried grass when supplies allow. He shrugs and says grass is warmer than snow, and that is all that matters. A faint whistling sound rises above the storm. A man next to you lifts his head, listening. Then he relaxes. Just wind threading through a distant ravine. But his reaction tells you everything. These men sleep lightly with ears tuned to danger, even in their dreams. Consensus has never fully formed among ranch historians about how many hours cowboys actually slept on winter nights. Some accounts claim they barely slept at all. Others insist they snatched 3 or 4 hours whenever the herd quieted. Watching them now, you can see how sleep was something stolen, not given. One cowboy lies down, pulling his hat low, tucking his chin into his coat collar. The fire reflects faintly on his boots. Another stretches out arms folded, face half buried in the blanket. Someone else sits upright for a moment, humming a low tune, maybe a lullaby learned long ago. The melody drifts through the air like a fragile thread. The man beside you uses a trick, he explains with a tired smile. He heats a small stone by the fire, wraps it in a spare cloth and tucks it near his stomach inside the bedroll. It holds the heat long enough to help him drift into sleep before the cold closes in again. The fire snaps sharply, sending a shower of sparks into the night. Several cowboys turn their heads automatically, checking the direction of the sparks, the strength of the wind, the balance of their bedrolls. Then they settle again. You lower yourself onto a canvas bedroll offered to you. The snow underneath feels firm but not unbearable. The cold creeps in around the edges, but the blanket above traps enough warmth that your body slowly adjusts. The storm swirls overhead, a vast humming force, but lying here among the cattlemen it feels more distant. Someone adds another log to the fire. The flames jump, warming your cheeks. Horses shift in the dark. Cowboys murmur to each other in low tones. The world contracts into a small circle of flickering orange light surrounded by endless white. You feel your muscles soften. The fire's warmth seeps into your bones. The storm becomes a steady backdrop rather than a threat. And as the cowboys around you close their eyes one by one, you let yourself drift into that same fragile, hard-earned sleep, the kind that settles only when you trust the people beside you to wake if danger comes. You pull the blanket close. The wind passes overhead like a distant roar, and you slip gently into rest, sheltered by nothing more than canvas courage and the quiet strength of men who learned to sleep under the wildest sky the West could offer. You ease yourself out of the cowboy camp and step back into the vast echoing dark. The wind has calmed only slightly enough for the snow to fall in thicker, quieter curtains. Your footsteps crunch softly as you move across the open plain. Ahead, you see a faint glow flickering behind a low rise. Not a cabin, not a sod house, a campfire. A lone fire breathing light into a space carved almost entirely from cold. You follow the glow until you come upon a circle of riders who have built their fire with practiced skill. The flames rise strong and steady, sheltered by cleverly placed rocks that form a semicircle. Their horses stand nearby, tails flicking occasionally, their breath puffing out in white plumes. A tall man in a worn coat nods at you. "Storm caught you too," he murmurs with a half smile. You step closer to the fire and feel an immediate wave of warmth across your shins. The heat is uneven, rising in bursts as the logs crackle and shift. These men are wanderers riders who spend more nights outdoors than are in a bed, people who have learned to sleep in ways most modern travellers would call impossible. One of the riders kneels beside the fire and tosses in a handful of dry twigs. They snap loudly as they catch flame. His face glows amber for a moment, revealing wind-chapped cheeks and eyes that have squinted through countless storms. He gestures toward the stones forming the campfire ring. Travel journals from the era make it evident that riders often heated stones in the fire before bedtime, placing them beneath blankets, or arranging them at the head and foot of their makeshift sleeping spots to radiate warmth through the night. You sit on a flattened saddlebag, feeling the heat rise around the fire in slow hypnotic waves. Smoke curls upward in steady ribbons, disappearing into the swirling snow. The air smells of charred wood, damp horsehair and cold iron from the tack. The scent settles in your lungs like something ancient. A rider with a thick moustache digs a shallow trench beside the fire. He explains that sleeping in a slight depression helps block the wind. He lines the trench with pine boughs, their needles crackling as he presses them into place. "Softens the ground," he says. And the smell helps. Indeed, the resinous fragrance wafts into the air, sharp and clean, cutting through the heaviness of the storm. Another man pulls his bedroll open, shaking out clumps of snow that cling stubbornly to the canvas. He checks the edges, ensuring no stray holes will let the cold creep inside. As he works, he mentions an unusual practice he once saw among northern trappers. Some sprinkled a pinch of their pipe tobacco inside the bedroll, claiming the scent deterred mice that might seek warmth. You raise an eyebrow and he laughs. Maybe it works, maybe it doesn't, but it smells better than wet wool. The others chuckle quietly, pulling their coats tighter. One man places his boots near the fire soles, facing the heat. He warns you not to put yours too close unless you want them to warp. His voice is low, gentle, shaped by long nights of conversation, spoken softly so as not to disturb resting horses. A pot hangs over the fire, its contents bubbling slowly. Soup, perhaps, or a thin stew meant to warm their insides before sleep. You accept a cup offered to you. The liquid is simple, but the warmth almost startles you. It spreads through your stomach and settles into your limbs, loosening muscles tight from walking through snow. Beside you, a young rider studies the sky through the storm's haze. If the wind turns east, he sees we'll need to shift the fire. You follow his gaze. The sky's a blur of moving white. Your eyes ache trying to read anything in its shifting patterns. Yet he seems to see something. Letters preserved from winter cattle runs point out that seasoned riders learn to read the sky by instinct rather than sight, trusting the way the wind touched their faces more than the shapes of the clouds. A soft debate begins between two of the men about whether the storm will break by morning or build into something worse. They disagree lightly without tension, as if both possibilities are expected outcomes. There is lingering uncertainty in academic study regarding how accurate frontier weather sense truly was. Some say riders possessed uncanny skill. Others argue luck played a larger role. Listening to the men now, you suspect the truth lies somewhere in between. You stretch your hands toward the fire and feel the heat pulse against your palms. The flames sway with each gust of wind, sending waves of warmth in shifting patterns. The men begin settling themselves into their prepared spots, each one carefully positioned in relation to the fire so that the warmth reaches them evenly. One man demonstrates a trick. He scoops a small layer of warm ash from the edge of the fire and scatters it beneath his bedroll. The ash creates a thin pocket of heat beneath him, a technique mentioned in the recollections of several old plains riders. It is subtle but effective, warming the ground just enough to keep the cold from creeping in too quickly. Another rider places a heated stone atop his saddle blanket and folds part of the wool over it, letting the warmth sink in. He gives you a nod, inviting you to do the same. You take a stone wrapped in cloth and hold it against your chest. The warmth is immediate, settling deep into your bones. As the men lie down, the storm thickens again. Snowflakes drift into the firelight like glowing insects melting the instant they touch the flames. Horses stamp in the darkness, their silhouettes shifting like shadows with breath. The riders speak in low tones about nothing urgent. Stories of towns they pass through, tales of horses that could outrun their own shadows, jokes shared softly so the night will not feel empty. Their voices soothe the air, weaving a blanket of calm above the crackling fire. One cowboy lifts his hat, scratches his head and lies back down. Another pulls his scarf over his nose. A third pats the dirt lightly, checking for any stray ember that might threaten the bedroll. They prepare for sleep, not with ceremony, but with instinct shaped by countless nights beneath the open sky. You settle into your place, slipping beneath a blanket that smells faintly of smoke and pine. The fire mirrors the breath of every man around it, rising and falling in a steady rhythmic pulse. The warmth drifts over you in gentle waves. The storm continues its song, a long, low hum that fills the plains. Yet here beside this carefully tended fire, surrounded by riders who understand how to coax warmth from a hostile night, you feel a quiet sense of belonging. Your eyes grow heavy. The fire snaps softly. The wind circles, but the heat holds. And you drift into a sleep shaped by embers, pine needles, and the whispered stories of wandering men who know how to tame the cold, with nothing more than firestones and time. You leave the ring of riders behind, stepping into a darkness that feels thicker than the storm itself. The wind moans across the open plain, shaping drifts into long sloping curves that mimic dunes in some frozen desert. Your breath fogs into a pale cloud before being snatched away. You trudge on your boots, sinking with a soft sigh into the snow, and then you see it, a low, rounded mound ahead, glowing faintly with lantern light leaking from a tiny gap. It looks like part of the landscape rather than a shelter built by human hands. But as you draw closer, you realize what it is. A snow hut. A makeshift sanctuary carved directly from the storm. You brush your glove against the curved wall, surprised by its solidity. Packed snow forms a smooth, firm surface, cold enough to bite at your skin even through the fabric. You duck through the narrow entrance, pushing aside a curtain of stitched burlap that flaps gently with the wind. Inside, the air is still dim and surprisingly warm compared to the open night. Your breath hangs softly in the enclosed space. A few figures sit around a small lantern, their silhouettes curved comfortably against the flowing contours of the interior walls. A man with frost on his beard gestures for you to sit. His voice is quiet, softened by the rounded acoustics of the hut. He explains that this shelter was shaped quickly during a sudden whiteout, when visibility vanished and temperatures plunged. Survey notes from frontier officials indicate that travellers improvise snow shelters more often than most people imagine, especially in regions where storms could swallow trails faster than a horse could step forward. Snow was not only a threat, it was a building material available in abundance on the coldest nights. You settle onto a blanket spread across the packed snow floor. Though the ground is cold, it feels insulated by the enclosing walls. The lantern flickers softly, its light dancing in delicate waves along the smooth interior. The space feels small but cozy, like a resting chamber hidden inside a glacier. A woman across from you shifts her position and nudges a small indentation carved into the wall. Inside, nestled against the icy curve, sits a tiny pouch of salt and a few slabs of dried meat. She chuckles at your glance and explains that the wall itself serves as a pantry, the cold preserving food better than any cellar. A strange comfort ritual mentioned by a handful of settlers involved licking a finger, touching it to the snow wall, and sampling the tiny grains of frost to predict whether the storm would worsen. She claims it tasted like the future. You smile, unsure whether she's teasing or perfectly serious. Another figure taps the wall gently. The sound rings softly, dull but steady. He explains how they shaped the hut, cutting blocks of snow, stacking them in a spiral, then sealing the gaps with loose powder until the structure held its weight. He points upward. The ceiling curves gracefully overhead, supported entirely by the cohesion of frozen crystals. It feels almost architectural, built by instinct and necessity, rather than tools and time. You touch the interior with your fingertips. The snow is smooth, almost glassy. It does not drip. It does not crumble. The lantern's warmth melts only a faint sheen, creating a delicate shimmer that runs across the curve like a faint star map. Someone has carved small vents near the top to let out smoke and moisture. The hut breathes slowly, giving you air without letting the cold rush in. One traveller tells you that before building the shelter, they tested the snow's strength using the butt of a rifle. If the snow broke apart too easily, they moved on. If it compressed cleanly, they knew it was safe. Period correspondence from riders on mail routes hints that such techniques were passed quietly from one traveller to another, shared like survival secrets whispered under breath. A youth bundled in a thick scarf reaches beside him and pulls out a flat stone warmed near the lantern. He hands it to you with care. The heat sinks into your palms, instantly filling the core of your hands with a gentle glow. He urges you to tuck it under your coat. You do, and the warmth spreads across your chest, calming the tremors that linger from the icy wind outside. The group begins preparing their sleeping spots. They scoop shallow hollows into the floor rounding them so the shape cradles their bodies. Someone places pine boughs into one hollow, their resinous scent rising into the air. Another spreads a blanket over their trench, testing the softness with a hand. All around you the hut feels alive with quiet shuffling and low murmurs. The acoustics soften every sound. The storm outside becomes a distant whisper, its fury reduced to a faint hum. It is astonishing how a shelter made of snow can mute the roar of a world trying to freeze you. You lean against the curved wall. It holds you in a gentle, icy embrace. Though cold, it feels stable, secure, almost protective. It dawns on you that snow normally the enemy has become the guardian tonight. A man near the lantern begins retelling an old trail story about a traveller who once slept in a snow hut so warm he removed his coat only to wake and find it frozen solid against the wall by morning. Scholarly opinion splits into several camps about the reliability of such tales. Some believe they are exaggerations shaped by nostalgia. Others argue they reflect real conditions, since snow shelters often trap warmth more effectively than thin canvas tents. Listening to the calm voices in this snug space, you suspect there is truth in both interpretations. The lantern glow dims as the flame settles lower. People stretch out under blankets. A woman drapes a quilt over her shoulders and leans against the wall, her breath rising slowly in the gentle warmth. Someone tucks the burlap entrance securely to block stray gusts. The youth curls into his snow hollow with a sigh that echoes faintly. You rest your head back, letting the warmth of the stone press into your chest. The snow hut holds its temperature steady and quiet. Your breathing slows. The storm whispers outside, but in here you feel cocooned inside a frozen shell that tempers its own chill. Your eyelids grow heavy. The lantern flickers. Quiet settles deeper, and you drift into sleep in a shelter shaped by cold hands and warm hope, held firmly within walls sculpted from the very storm that sought to stop you. You step out of the snow hut and back into the storm's restless breath. The cold feels sharper after the quiet cocoon of packed ice. It pinches your cheeks and crawls inside your collar. The night stretches onward, and you begin moving toward a distant cluster of lights blinking through the drifting snow. These lights look different from the warm glow of cabins and homesteads. They flicker with a steady industrial rhythm, taller and harsher against the sky. The shapes rise like spines from the horizon. You realize you're approaching a railroad town. As you walk closer, the faint clatter of metal reaches your ears. A switch track groans under the weight of blown snow. The smell of coal smoke hangs heavy in the air. The storm muffles everything except the occasional hiss of steam from a resting locomotive. Even through the swirling white, you can make out the boxy silhouette of bunkhouses lining the tracks, each one crowded with men whose work does not pause for weather. You push open the nearest door and step inside. Warmth hits you hard. The air is thick with the smell of sweat, wet wool, sawdust, coal dust, and something like stale bread. A line of bunks stretches along both walls. Some mattresses are stuffed with straw. Others are simply canvas stretched over wooden frames. Thin blankets hang like flags over the edges. A few men glance up as you enter, but most remain hunched over mugs of something hot or curled beneath their covers, trying to reclaim heat lost to the storm. One observation preserved in work camp ledgers makes it clear that railroad bunkhouses often served as temporary winter shelters for crews caught between routes, with up to 20 men crushed into spaces meant for half that number. Looking around, you see exactly what those records meant. Elbows touch elbows. Boots overlap under bunks. Someone's coat hangs so close to the stovepipe that it steams continuously. A foreman sits at a rough table near a stove, feeding small chunks of coal into its glowing belly. His hair shines with melted frost, and his eyes are half-lidded with exhaustion. He waves you toward an empty stretch of bench and pushes a dented tin cup across the table. The liquid inside is some kind of coffee substitute, thin but warm enough to thaw your throat. The bunkhouse vibrates softly as a locomotive outside releases a hiss of pressure. The men barely react. This noise is their lullaby, their constant reminder that work continues no matter the weather. A lanky worker sitting beside you rubs his arms vigorously through his jacket, trying to chase off lingering cold. He tells you the bunks closest to the stove are coveted. Most men rotate through them by unwritten rule. Too much heat for too long dries out the wood planks overhead, so when someone sleeps there for hours, another takes their place. It is a system born of necessity, not kindness. With this many bodies, fairness is warmth, and warmth is survival. A man on the upper bunk rolls over, sending down a soft avalanche of dust and fabric fragments. He grumbles and tugs his thin blanket tighter. You notice he has stuffed his boots with bits of newspaper so they will not freeze solid by morning. A curious little detail recorded in a machinist's notebook mentions that some workers filled their boots with warm ashes before sleep for the same reason. Not common, but described with enough sincerity to feel plausible. You scan the room. You would not be surprised if someone here has tried the same trick. A group of younger men gather around a crate near the stove, passing a tin of something that smells faintly of beans. They speak quietly, conserving energy. Their breaths fog the air. One of them flicks a glance at the window where frost blossoms like delicate flowers across the glass. He shrugs and mutters that the wind is shifting, judging by the pattern. You raise an eyebrow. He says his father taught him to read frost the same way others read clouds. Rival interpretations among industrial historians linger about whether such folk methods carried real accuracy, or were simply habits inherited from older frontiers. Hearing the certainty in the young man's voice, you can imagine how belief becomes its own form of warmth. A man near the back begins coughing into his sleeve, harsh scraping coughs that echo in the cramped room. The foreman hands him a cloth dipped in vinegar from a jar under the table. The bite of the scent immediately fills the air. The worker presses the cloth over his mouth and breathes slowly. It is an old remedy passed around camps and cabins in equal measure. The sharp smell clears the sinuses but also stings the eyes. On the far bunk, two men share a thick wool blanket. One has his back against the wall, the other curled toward the stove. They sleep with their knees touching, not out of friendship, but because body heat is more valuable than pride. Railroad reports from the decade reveal that men often slept 2 or 3 to a bed during the worst storms, rotating positions when the cold became unbearable. A lantern swings slightly from the rafter, swaying with each gust of wind that shakes the building. The shadows dance across the bunks, giving faces soft, fleeting shapes. Some look peaceful, others look tense, like sleep fights the cold rather than embracing it. Near the stove, a man removes his gloves and holds his hands to the warmth. His fingers are cracked, raw and stiff. He flexes them slowly, murmuring something about having hammered spikes all day despite the storm. His voice carries both pride and exhaustion. You sense how much these men endure, how their sleep depends not on comfort, but simply on the chance to stop moving. Someone hands you a folded blanket. It smells of smoke oil and iron, but it is a gift. You spread it across your legs, letting the heat seep through. Then a whistle shrieks outside, long and mournful. Several men flinch reflexively before realizing it is only the wind pulling at the lines. You feel the building tremble slightly from the gust. Snow pellets rattle against the windows like thrown pebbles. But the stove continues to burn and the men settle back into their quiet rhythms. A worker on the lowest bunk sighs heavily. He rolls onto his back, staring at the ceiling beams. "Colder than last winter," he mutters. Another man chuckles and replies that storms always seem worse when you're tired. Their voices fade as their breathing steadies. You rise and look around the room. Quilts bunch around shoulders. Hats become makeshift pillows. Hands curl beneath blankets. The bunkhouse grows warmer with every shared breath, every body pressed into the cramped space. The storm hammers the world outside, but inside the heat gradually wins the fight. You settle onto your stretch of bench again, pulling the blanket up to your chin. The room hums with low snores and shifting blankets. The stove glows red, its light pooling across the floor. Your eyes grow heavy. In this railroad bunkhouse, comfort is thin, space is tight, but warmth survives, and that is enough. You let yourself sink into the layered breathing around you, feeling the collective endurance of men who lay down their fatigue in rooms like this across the frozen west. The storm growls, the bunks creak, the fire beats steadily, and you drift into sleep wrapped in the dense human warmth of a night spent among iron workers and railway crews, the unsung guardians of winter's darkest hours. You leave the railroad bunkhouse with its thick, mingled warmth still clinging faintly to your clothes. The storm greets you again with a hard gust, as if annoyed that you dared step outside. Snow whips into spirals around your boots, and the ground beneath you feels uneven, pitted with half-buried stones and patches of ice. You push forward, following a narrow trail that winds uphill between jagged outcroppings. The land rises into dark shapes, and soon you hear the faint familiar ring of metal echoing through the storm. A mining camp. A place where the earth itself becomes a shelter when snow turns the world above into a frozen threat. You crest a ridge and see lanterns flickering like lost fireflies against the steep slope. Smoke drifts lazily from a cluster of makeshift chimneys wedged into the hillside. The cabins here look different. Lower, heavier. Many are half dug into the rock using the mountain as their backbone. It makes sense. Up here in the mining territories, wood was precious and weather was merciless. Travellers' field notes from the decade make it plain that miners often slept inside dugouts, tunnel mouths, or tight rock shelters when storms hit, relying on the Earth's steady temperature to spare them from the deadly cold. As you approach one of the entrances, a man in a soot-covered coat waves you inside. You duck through the low frame and step into a dim room cut partly from timber, partly from stone, and partly from the mountain itself. The walls are cool to the touch, but strangely protective, like they stand firm no matter how the storm claws at them from outside. The air is warmer than you expect. A furnace glows softly in the corner, its heat spreading unevenly across the space. Shadows leap across the rocky walls, creating wavering patterns like distant waves on a dark shore. Several miners sit around the furnace, their faces illuminated by its dull orange glow. Their cheeks are streaked with coal dust. Their boots are caked in frozen mud. But their shoulders relax when you enter, as though another body simply adds to the sense of safety. You take a seat on an overturned crate near the entrance. A miner hands you a tin mug filled with water warm enough to steam faintly. You sip it gratefully. The taste carries a slight mineral tang, as if the mountain itself lent something to it. Bedding here is simple. Rough cots lined with woven mats, blankets patched with scraps of old shirts, flour bags and bits of canvas. Some men have spread their coats across their beds to create insulating layers. Others stuff their boots with rolled socks and place them under their blankets to keep them warm for dawn. Nearby, a young miner adjusts a narrow sleeping platform carved from the rock wall. He tucks a blanket beneath his knees and explains that the stone holds warmth better than the floor, so long as you place something between your skin and the cold surface. You run your hand over the rock. It feels solid, dependable, moulded by time rather than weather. A subtle reassurance rises in the stillness. Here the mountain is not the enemy. It is the guardian. One man begins sharpening a pickaxe by lantern light, the rhythmic scrape carrying a steady cadence. He explains that he works during storms if he cannot sleep. Keeps my hands busy, he says with a shrug, and my mind quieter. You realize how much activity is shaped by restlessness in these camps. Sleep does not come easily when the wind roars through the shafts and tunnels. On a nearby wall, someone has carved initials into the rock. Beneath them, faint marks form a crude calendar scratched with charcoal. Each line, each tick represents days survived, shifts completed, storms endured. You brush your fingertips across the markings. They feel gritty, honest, soaked with the sweat of the men who press their weight into the walls night after night. A miner sitting beside you lifts a small pouch from his coat pocket and spills a few lumps of something onto the table, hard sugar candies wrapped in crinkled paper. He offers one to you with a grin. He explains that sucking on a piece before bed warms the chest, at least according to his grandfather. The idea might sound fanciful, but a light-hearted frontier quirk recorded in a faded notebook reveals that some miners believed a lump of sugar at night kept breath steady in cold air. You unwrap the candy and let it dissolve on your tongue. Its sweetness softens the edges of the storm, howling faintly through cracks in the timbers. Across the room, two older miners discuss whether the wind is shifting eastward. They argue in low voices, comparing how the drafts move across the floorboards. Their conversation reminds you of an unresolved question that persists in mining history circles. Analysts continue to question whether miners truly could read storm patterns based on cave drafts, or simply convinced themselves they could. Listening to the men, now you sense it is a blend of skill and old habit. The furnace crackles, sparks skitter behind the grate. Someone adds another chunk of coal and the heat flares upward in a bright pulse. Shadows shift again, sliding across the stone walls like restless spirits. The warmth seeps into your legs, your back, your chest. It feels primal, almost ancient, the kind of heat that humans have trusted since the first fires were lit in caves. A miner in a patched coat lies back on his cot, resting his arms behind his head. He tells you that sleeping underground feels the same whether it is midsummer or deep winter. The mountain doesn't change its mind, he says quietly. It stays the same year after year. Weather can't touch it. There is something comforting in that thought, something steady and unmoving in a world that often feels chaotic. Near the entrance, a man shapes a small pile of ash beneath his cot. He explains that he uses it as a barrier to block drafts creeping through the tunnel mouth. You place your hand near the floor and feel the slight movement of cold air passing by. In a space like this, even a thin breath of wind can nudge a sleeper awake. A woman in work trousers, her hair tied back with a strip of cloth, sharpens a lantern hook and hums a tune so low it blends with the soft roar of the furnace. She has the look of someone who has lived half her life underground, reading the rock as naturally as others read sky and cloud. Someone stirs a pot hanging above a small side fire. The broth inside smells earthy rich with root vegetables and a hint of herbs. You accept a small bowl when it is offered. The warmth fills your chest once more, settling the last traces of cold from outside. One by one, the miners prepare for sleep. They wrap blankets around their shoulders. They wedge their cots closer to the furnace. They tighten woolen hats around their ears. The fire glows steadily, casting its steady orange breath throughout the chamber. As the storm outside thrashes the mountainside inside the dugout, you hear only the soft breathing of resting miners, the sigh of heat rising from the furnace, and the faint tapping of wind against rock. You lie back on a borrowed mat, letting the stone wall hold the weight of your head. The heat of the furnace drifts across your cheeks. The earthy smell of the mountain surrounds you, grounding you deeper than any quilt-lined cabin could. Your eyes close. The warmth from the furnace pulses in steady waves. The storm's rage feels far away, softened by hundreds of tons of rock, and you drift into sleep in a room carved from the mountain's ribs, held secure by earth that has seen countless storms and will see countless more. You leave the mining dugout behind and return to the storm, which greets you with a slap of icy wind, as if reminding you who truly rules these plains. Snow dances in frantic spirals across the ground, and the darkness feels deeper, now more secretive. You push forward through the drifting white until a faint cluster of lights forms ahead. These are not the warm glows of homes or the rough flickers of campfires. They shine from windows lined in neat rows like teeth, glowing softly in the night. A frontier hotel. You approach the structure, its timbers coated in frost, its sign barely legible beneath clinging snow. The front steps creak as you climb them, and when you push the door open, warmth spills out with a welcoming breath. The interior is dim and narrow, lit only by a few lanterns hung along the hallway. The floorboards groan under your weight. The air smells like smoke, old laundry, cold iron, and something faintly sweet perhaps from pies cooling earlier in the evening. The lobby is a cramped room furnished with mismatched chairs. A tall stove stands in the corner, glowing faintly. Behind a desk sits a tired-looking clerk wrapped in a quilt draped like a shawl over his shoulders. He nods without bothering to stand, motioning you toward the stairway. Detailed accounts written at the time demonstrate that these frontier hotels, often called boarding houses, offered little privacy and even less warmth. Yet they became crucial winter shelters for travellers caught between towns. You climb the narrow stairs and enter a hall so thin your shoulders almost brush the walls. Doors line each side, each one slightly warped from years of cold weather pressing against them. You hear the muffled coughs of strangers behind the wooden panels. You choose a door left slightly ajar and step inside. The room is small. A single bed stands against one wall, its frame made of rough-hewn pine. A thin mattress sits atop it, covered in a faded quilt. You touch the fabric. It feels stiff with cold, like it has absorbed the winter air all day. A chipped basin sits on a stand beside the bed, its water frozen into a thin crust of ice. A single candle flickers on the tiny dresser, its flame bending each time the wind sneaks in through cracks around the window frame. You run your hand along the wall, the paint is peeling, the wood beneath it feels brittle. The cold moves through the room like a slow tide. A man in the next room sneezes loudly and you hear someone mutter about needing another blanket. On the floor near your feet you notice a pair of boots stuffed with rags. The owner, an older traveller hunched over the window, glances back at you and explains that the rags keep the boots from turning to ice overnight. He chuckles and notes how many travellers learned such tricks the hard way. A whimsical habit preserved in a family's oral story suggests that some guests set their boots beneath their pillows for warmth, believing the warmth from their dreams would soak into the leather. You cannot tell if he's joking, but you see a faint smile in his eyes. You sit on the bed and immediately feel the chill rise through the mattress. The man tells you that the rooms closest to the lobby fire are the warmest, and the rooms upstairs catch the brunt of the cold. Tonight, the guests downstairs are likely snoring softly in relative comfort, while those in the upper rooms fight drafts and stiff quilts. He pulls another blanket from his bag, shaking loose a puff of dust. The hotel walls creak as the wind presses against them. The candle flame trembles. The older traveller grips the edge of the window frame and mutters that the wind is veering southeast. He gestures for you to place your hand near the window to feel the shift. You press your fingers against the frame. A cold ribbon of air leaks through, thin as a thread, but strong enough to chill your skin. Modern researchers approach this detail cautiously, unsure whether frontier travellers truly read storms through such minute drafts, or simply learned to anticipate danger through experience more than observation. You move toward the stove in the hallway, curious. The door is open, revealing a few glowing embers inside. A woman sits on the stair, warming her hands over the weak heat. She murmurs that the staff stokes the stove only a few times during the night to conserve fuel. Her voice carries a resigned warmth, as if she has spent many winters in places just like this. A low rumble echoes from downstairs as a group of travellers returns from the common room. Their boots strike the floor heavily, their laughter muted by fatigue. Two of them climb the stairs, rubbing their hands and stomping snow from their clothes. One carries a wrapped parcel of leftover bread, and the faint smell of yeast trails behind him. Back in your room, you inspect the bed more closely. It sags in the middle, creating a shallow dip where dozens of travellers have lain before you. You press your hand against the quilt again. It has patches of floral prints and scraps of flannel sewn together in crooked lines. Perhaps someone stitched it by lantern light in this very room, determined to fend off another winter. The older traveller finally sits on his own bed, removes his boots and tucks them beneath the blanket at the foot of the mattress. He hums a tune soft and toneless, just enough to fill the silence. The candle flickers in response, casting shifting shadows along the walls. A distant knock echoes from the hallway as another guest arrives. You hear a muffled conversation between the clerk and someone asking for the warmest room. The clerk laughs softly, not unkindly, and says the warmest room is whichever one has a good sleeper in it. You lie down, pulling the quilt over your body. The mattress is lumpy but serviceable. The cold clings at first, but your body heat slowly seeps into the bedding. You tuck the quilt beneath your chin, and the smell of old fabric, soot and lavender soap rises gently around you. The wind rattles the window frame. Snow taps against the glass like a timid visitor. Somewhere downstairs, a door thuds shut. The older traveller extinguishes his candle, his room falling into quiet darkness. You adjust your pillow. The faint warmth you generate begins to settle, creating a fragile bubble of comfort in the draughty room. Your eyelids droop, and as the walls creak, the candle dies, and the storm outside continues its wild dance. You drift into sleep within this humble frontier hotel, a resting place balanced between cold reality and the simple promise of shelter. You leave the frontier hotel behind and step once more into the restless dark. The storm seems almost offended that you escaped the draughty little room, and it lashes out with a fresh spray of snow that cuts across your cheeks. You pull your coat tight and walk toward a cluster of shapes barely visible through the swirling white. These forms look rounder, softer, arranged with intention rather than convenience, and soon as you approach the gentle glow of firelight leaking from the edges of hide-covered frames, you realize where you're heading: an indigenous winter camp. The storm hushes slightly as you draw near, as if held at bay by the quiet dignity of the place. Smoke rises in thin, graceful streams from each shelter, curling into the night sky. The snow around the encampment is trampled and patterned with footprints, each mark softened by new flakes drifting down. You pause for a moment, taking in the scene. These lodges do not fight the winter, they coexist with it. A person standing near one of the entrances nods to you and gestures for you to come inside. You lift the flap and step into a space where warmth wraps around you instantly, not with the uneven heat of stoves or the frantic burn of campfires, but with a steady, balanced softness. The interior glows with amber light from a small central fire, its flames low and controlled. The structure feels both open and enclosed, shaped by logic older than the cabins and bunkhouses you have visited. You sit on a woven mat, feeling the firm but warm surface beneath you. The fire's heat rises, gently drawn upward through a vent at the top. Someone adjusts a flap to control the draft, guiding the smoke toward the opening. Seasonal reports compiled by early settlers confirm that indigenous winter lodges were remarkably efficient, designed to hold warmth even during the fiercest storms. Sitting here, you feel that truth settle into your bones. Around the fire, blankets made from bison hide and carefully tanned deerskin hang near the walls ready for sleep. Their surfaces shine with a subtle sheen, and the scent of smoke and cedar lingers in their fibres. A woman brushes one of the hides with a carved wooden tool, smoothing it with practiced care. She offers you a smaller piece to feel. It is soft, warm, and almost shockingly light compared to the buffalo robes you encountered earlier. A young person beside you arranges layers of bedding on the ground. Thick furs for insulation, woven blankets over them, then a final hide to trap warmth. You run your fingers along the layers. They hold heat beautifully and their textures blend together in a comforting way. It is easy to imagine sinking into these materials and letting the storm pass unnoticed. Near the far wall sits a bundle of sage and sweetgrass. Its fragrance drifts softly into the space each time the fire pops. The earthy scent grounds the air, lifting some of the heaviness of the storm. One surprisingly eccentric winter trick remembered by locals describes burning a braid of sweetgrass before sleep to keep the airlight inside a storm night lodge. The person tending the fire smiles at your expression, neither confirming nor denying the old tale. Someone pours warm liquid into a small bowl and hands it to you. The drink is mild, faintly sweet and soothing. It warms your throat without the harshness of coffee or broth. You savour each sip, feeling your body relax little by little. A child yawns and crawls beneath a blanket beside their mother. The blanket is embroidered with geometric designs, calm and balanced in shape. The child curls close, and their mother tucks the edges around them. You watch the layers mould effortlessly to the small body beneath them. Everything here seems designed not just for warmth, but for harmony. Nearby, a man adjusts a wooden pole supporting the lodge. He checks the bindings with gentle pressure, making sure the structure remains tight. As he works, he tells a quiet story about ancestors who perfected these winter shelters long before settlers reached these lands. His voice carries pride, but also calm a sense of continuity. The shelter feels timeless, shaped by generations who observed wind patterns, snow weight, and fire behaviour with patient eyes. You glance upward at the vent. It is wider now, letting the smoke escape freely. The cold air entering from below the edge of the lodge creates a natural convection that keeps the interior warm without stifling the fire. Analysts of early architecture note this airflow design as one of the most effective natural heating systems ever developed for harsh climates. Someone tosses a handful of dried herbs onto the fire. Their aroma blooms instantly, mingling with the warm air. The sound of snow hitting the outside of the lodge softens into a gentle tapping. The storm has not eased, but the shelter transforms its fury into a distant murmur. Two people near the side wall discuss the shape of the storm, debating in low tones whether the wind will turn or settle. Their conversation brings to mind an unresolved tangle of opinions among experts about how indigenous communities predicted winter weather. Some claim their insights came from generations of observation. Others argue spiritual interpretation played a larger role. Listening to them now, the distinction seems unnecessary. Their knowledge feels lived, practiced, trusted. A woman rolls up an extra hide and places it near the wall as a pillow. She motions for you to rest. You lie back on the layered bedding, sinking slightly into the fur beneath you. The warmth rises quickly, surrounding your body with steady heat. The fire crackles softly. The air moves gently through the lodge. Every sound is smooth and rounded, softened by hide walls and patience. Your host pulls an additional blanket over your legs, its edges warm from hanging near the fire. You breathe deeply, the sense of cedar sage and smoke settling around you. The storm outside fades into a distant hum like the sea heard through thick stone. Your eyes grow heavy as the fire flickers in soft pulses. Shadows sway across the ceiling, the bedding moulds around your hips and shoulders. A soft song hums from somewhere near the fire, barely louder than breath itself, and you drift into sleep inside this warm, living shelter, where centuries of winter wisdom gather around you like an unseen circle of guardians, holding the storm at a respectful distance. You leave the circle of the winter lodge with its soft cedar-scented warmth, still resting lightly on your skin. The moment you step outside, the storm reclaims you with a fierce gust that snaps across your face and pours handfuls of snow down your collar. You hunch your shoulders and press forward, guided only by a faint golden glow trembling in the distance. The shapes ahead are boxy, stacked and uneven. As you draw closer, you recognize them trading posts, those rough wooden outposts where goods, gossip and shelter converged in the middle of nowhere. The first building you approach creaks under the weight of snow pressed against its walls. A hand-painted sign hangs crookedly above the door. You push inside and find yourself in a cramped room crowded with crates, barrels, bundles of pelts, crockery, rope coils and shelves bowed under the weight of supplies. The warmth inside is uneven but pleasant, created by a small iron stove shoved near the back. The air smells of leather pine resin, dried tobacco, and faint traces of spilled molasses. A storekeeper behind a counter nods at you, tightening wool mittens as he shuffles ledger papers. He gestures toward a bench near the stove, the universal language for sit before you freeze stiff. You take the offer gladly. The heat feels steady and honest, rising in slow waves as the wood inside crackles gently. Two families sit on folded blankets near the far wall. A small girl picks at the frayed edge of a burlap sack, while her mother rearranges bedding against a stack of crates. Tools and merchandise have been pushed aside to make room for sleeping space. It is clear they will spend the night here. Inventories compiled by frontier clerks point to the fact that trading posts often doubled as dormitories during storms, offering refuge to those stranded between settlements or unable to risk the long ride home. You run your hand over a wooden crate beside you. It is packed with folded quilts and a stack of beadwork bags. But more importantly, the crate itself is part of the insulation. The storekeeper explains that he and his partners pack crates against the walls each winter to keep out drafts. Sometimes grain sacks and pelts are added into any remaining cracks. This room is built not just from timber, but from the very goods meant to be sold. A small boy toddles over holding a lantern. He lifts it toward a patch of wall stuffed with fur scraps. "Keeps the cold back," he says proudly. You smile. He is not wrong. The warmth stays in this little room with a surprising stubbornness. From behind the counter, the storekeeper reveals a small wooden box filled with dried berries. He nudges it toward you, saying you can take a few to warm your insides. The berries are tart, almost sharp, but they brighten your senses in a pleasant way. A rarely mentioned superstition whispered among old-timers claims that dried berries eaten on winter nights keep the spirit awake, meaning they fend off both drowsiness and chill. You chew slowly, wondering whether warmth can truly come from something so small. A man near the door pulls a bearskin over his shoulders and checks the window. It rattles with each gust of wind. Beneath the window, sacks of flour and wheat are piled almost to the sill. They help block the cold. He presses his palm against the crack where wood and glass meet, then nods in satisfaction. The cold is held at bay, at least for now. The storekeeper adjusts the stove's dampers and leans over a barrel marked with ink. He tells you he learned long ago that storms like this can last days. The trick, he murmurs, is to keep the fire alive and the walls crowded. You look around and see just how crowded they are. Boxes of nails, bundles of cloth, bales of hay, pelts hanging from rafters like thick shaggy curtains. These items meant for trade overwhelm the space, yet they turn the room into something almost cozy. Soft shadows dance on the walls. The storm outside becomes a low growl muffled by fur cloth and crates. Two traders sitting near the back discuss the temperature. One claims tonight is colder than the deadly freeze 3 winters ago. The other disagrees, insisting that storm did not howl as fiercely. Their banter reminds you of the conflicting descriptions often found in personal accounts of frontier weather. Specialists examining the era still reach differing conclusions about how extreme certain storms truly were given, that measurements were rarely precise. Listening to these two, you sense that memory and exaggeration blend easily when cold is involved. A woman in the corner unrolls a thick quilt embroidered with carefully stitched patterns. She spreads it over a mound of bundled pelts that will serve as her bed. Her husband kneels beside her, checking the floor for drafts. They speak softly, their voices warm despite the storm. The girl who had been playing with the burlap sack curls beneath the quilt, her small body sinking into the plush pile of furs beneath her. You watch as the storekeeper lowers a lantern and hangs it near the stove. The light glows warmly, carved into the haze of smoke and dust motes swirling gently through the air. You feel the storm's pressure outside, but it no longer feels threatening. In here, the shelves and goods form thick defences. One trader pulls a folded piece of canvas from a high shelf. He drapes it across a beam overhead, creating a makeshift canopy above the sleeping families. The canvas rustles softly. He explains that it helps hold warm air closer to the ground. You tilt your head upward. The higher parts of the room feel noticeably colder. He is right. The canvas traps the heat like a soft, low ceiling. The storekeeper pours warm water into cups made from tin and hands them around. The steam drifts upward in narrow ribbons. You cradle one cup, letting the heat seep slowly into your fingers. The warmth spreads through your arms, your chest, your mind. As the storm outside beats against the thickened walls, the trading post fills with quiet murmurs and slow movements. People adjust blankets. Someone hums a low tune. A dog sleeping under a counter twitches occasionally in its dreams. The smells of leather wool and wood smoke mingle in a comforting haze. Your eyes grow heavy. You slide down the crate behind you until you're almost lying against it. A quilt is draped over your legs by someone passing by. You pull it close. The patchwork stitching presses softly against your cheek. Around you, the trading post breathes warmth into the storm's cold. Goods meant for sale become guardians of the night. Pelts, grain, cloth, all of it joins together to shield weary travellers. The storm snarls beyond the walls, but inside calm thickens like honey in warm air, and you drift gently into sleep, surrounded by the soft rustle of furs, the steady glow of lanterns, and the quiet heartbeat of a trading post transformed into a sanctuary. You step out of the trading post and into a night that feels sharper than before, as if the storm has grown curious about you. Snow curls at your feet in restless little waves. The wind carries a faint distant sound, not quite a howl, not quite a whistle. You follow it across a stretch of open land until you see a faint lantern swinging beside a narrow doorway built into a low wooden structure. A relay cabin. One of the tiny outposts used by mail carriers who crossed impossible distances in weather that frightened even the hardiest settlers. As you approach, a horse tied to the post snorts, its breath rising like smoke from a chimney. You pat its flank gently. The animal trembles slightly, its coat stiff with frost. You know this creature must have been running in the dark just moments ago. You push open the cabin door and warm air spills out in a hurried sigh. Inside the room is small and tightly built, stocked with supplies that look more practical than comfortable. 2 bunks sit against the walls. Saddles hang from wooden pegs. A pot rests on a stove glowing faintly red. A man sits nearby, rubbing his hands together while watching a kettle that rattles gently as steam escapes. He glances up as you enter and nods without surprise. Relay stations like this often served as shelter for anyone wandering during a storm. Handwritten logs maintained at such way stations reveal that travellers' ranch hands, and even the occasional lost homesteader, relied on these cabins when visibility dropped and snow swallowed the landscape. The mail carrier sets aside his gloves and gestures for you to warm yourself. His face is wind-burned, his eyes slightly reddened. A thick scarf hangs from his neck, still coated in ice crystals. You step toward the stove, letting the heat collect across your palms. It feels uneven but persistent, like a small heartbeat fighting against the cold. A second carrier sleeps on one of the bunks wrapped in a blanket full of patched squares. He snores softly, shifting occasionally as if running in his dreams. At the foot of his bed sits a small wooden chest engraved with initials. You recognize it instantly from frontier accounts. These chests carried letters, medicines, small parcels, and emergency supplies for riders who might not reach the next cabin until morning. You sit on a stool while the carrier pours you a tin cup of something warm. The liquid tastes earthy and slightly bitter, perhaps brewed from leftover herbs and water stored in the barrel near the door. He shrugs and says it is whatever keeps the cold from settling in your ribs. You drink anyway, feeling the heat push through your chest. As you look around the cramped cabin, you notice sacks piled in the corner. They are tightly packed with woolen goods. Not for insulation, you realize, but for trading along the mail routes. The carrier explains that the sacks double as windbreaks when placed along the walls. That trick feels clever enough to note. A softly whispered odd custom recounted in campfire stories hints that some riders even slept on top of supply sacks, believing the stored cloth absorbed heat better than bare wood. Whether true or simply playful lore, the idea makes the carrier chuckle. The wind rattles the cabin door, pushing snow through the narrow gaps. The carrier stands and wedges a folded hide against the frame to block the draft. His movements are practiced and calm. It is obvious he's done this countless times. He tells you that storms often force riders to stay longer than planned. Relay cabins become temporary homes, workstations, or warm islands in a white swirling sea. He checks the clock hanging above the stove. The storm may delay the route until dawn. His partner stirs in the bunk, mumbles something incoherent, and then settles again. Their horses outside shift and stamp in the snow, occasionally shaking frost from their manes. You walk toward the window with its thick frost. Someone has scraped a small circle clear to look at the sky. Through it you see only darkness filled with moving white. The carrier joins you and squints. He describes how riders read the faint sounds carried by the wind to determine whether the storm was lifting or tightening. The fragmentary evidence leaves scholars divided over whether this method held real accuracy or rested mostly on intuition honed by experience. Listening to him now, his voice steady and sure, you suspect those instincts were sharpened by countless lonely rides, through nights just like this one. The carrier invites you to look at a small map pinned to the wall. Faded lines mark the relay station stretching across the territory. Each dot represents a place like this where a pot of warm drink and a patched blanket wait for anyone who stumbles through the door. You trace the lines slowly and imagine how many riders endured nights on these trails, each trusting these modest cabins to break the winter's grip. A soft noise catches your attention. The sleeping rider rolls onto his side and pulls his blanket tighter. Beneath the bunk, a small tin filled with coals glows faintly. The carrier explains it is a trick he sometimes uses. Place a covered ember pot under the bed to warm the boards just enough to chase away the deepest chill. A peculiar improvisation mentioned in passing by an elderly settler recounts that some riders even placed warm stones inside old socks and tucked them under their shirts before sleeping. The carrier laughs and admits he tried that once but burned a hole clean through the fabric. He strolls to the door and opens it a crack to check on the horses. A blast of cold hits the room, swirling snow across the floor. He shuts it quickly and sets a heavy latch. Then he presses his ear to the wood for a moment, listening to the sounds outside. You hear faint stomping, a low whinny, and the whisper of snow sliding down the cabin roof. A fire pops softly, sending sparks dancing behind the stove's grate. Shadows ripple across the walls. The room feels warm enough, full enough, safe enough. You settle on your stool again, pulling a folded blanket from a hook and draping it across your shoulders. The fibres smell of wool smoke and faint traces of damp leather. The carrier takes his seat on the lower bunk, rubbing his eyes. He speaks quietly about nights he spent riding through storms so thick he could barely see his horse's ears. He explains how each relay cabin feels like a returning friend, always there, always waiting. You imagine him stumbling toward one after a 14-hour ride, half frozen, steering his horse purely on memory. The kettle rattles again, signalling its readiness. He pours a second cup for himself, steam rising in a thin silver thread. He sighs and sinks deeper into his seat, letting his muscles slacken. Outside, the wind lifts and drops, searching for weak spots in the walls. The cabin vibrates faintly, but it holds firm. Your eyes feel heavier as the heat settles deeper into your bones. The sleeping rider's quiet snores fill the room in steady rhythm. The carrier leans back, his head resting against the log wall, his scarf slipping slightly, to reveal a pale patch of skin warmed by the stove's glow. With the fire humming softly, the storm muttering outside and the relay cabin cradling you in its small circle of warmth, you let your breath slow and your eyelids fall. This is how riders survive the longest nights, with simple, heat-tired horses, nearby patched blankets, and the promise of another safe doorway somewhere along the trail. You drift gently into sleep, wrapped in the calm heartbeat of the relay cabin. You leave the relay cabin with its steady glow still clinging to your senses, stepping directly into the storm's icy teeth. The wind grabs at your coat, pulling like a stubborn child. Snow gusts sideways, sharp and fast. Yet through the shifting white, a faint shimmer of lamplight trembles atop a small hill. You follow it, boots crunching in deepening drifts until the silhouette of a homestead takes shape. A wide roof, a sagging porch, smoke twisting thinly from a crooked chimney, and behind the frosted window you glimpse movement. Women at work. You push open the door and step inside. Warmth greets you in soft waves, not from a roaring fire, but from a steady hearth, fed carefully and deliberately. The room is filled with the layered scent of boiled water, damp wool soap, and something faintly metallic, perhaps from needles and shears scattered across the table. Several women are busy with tasks that seem endless: mending quilts, boiling cloth, patching coats, stitching torn gloves, warming stones, steeping herbs, checking boots for cracks. All of them move with practiced rhythm. A woman near the hearth looks up and gestures you inside. She clears a stool for you with her elbow while keeping her other hand busy threading a needle. You sit watching the flurry of motion around the room. Notes penned by early observers confirm without ambiguity that women's nightly labour in winter often meant the difference between a comfortable sleep and a dangerously cold one. Here you see that truth in action. Every stitch, every warmed stone, every checked seam is a quiet act of protection. On the table rests a spread of material, scraps of wool, buttons saved from older garments, strips of flannel, small pieces of canvas, braids of dried herbs, and jars filled with grease. A young woman dips her fingers into one jar and rubs the substance into the seams of a pair of boots. It smells faintly of animal fat. She explains that sealing leather prevents snow melt from seeping in and turning toes numb in minutes. Her hands move quickly, confidently, the way someone works when the weather has trained them toward constant preparation. Across the room, an older woman works at a wash basin heated by stones pulled from the fire. Steam rises gently as she scrubs fabric with a wooden paddle. She lifts the cloth, wrings it out, and drapes it over a line strung across the rafters. Droplets fall softly to the floor, quickly cooling in the frigid air that sneaks through the old wood walls. She mutters about wishing they had more soap. Her daughter laughs and says they need more of everything in a winter like this. A kettle simmers beside the hearth, sending up the fragrance of dried plant leaves. A woman dips a ladle and pours the liquid into a cup. She hands it to you. The drink tastes earthy, warm, slightly bitter. She explains it helps the throat stay clear during long nights in drafty houses. A tiny, nearly forgotten eccentricity preserved in personal margins reveals that some families believed this drink also sharpened the mind enough to perform careful stitching late into the night. You examine the cup. Whether or not the belief holds truth, the drink certainly wakes your senses. A girl no older than 12 sits cross-legged on the floor repairing a quilt with scraps of bright fabric. She hums under her breath, stitching small triangles into place. Her fingertips move with surprising precision. You ask how long she's been sewing. She shrugs and says she does not remember a time she did not know how. Her mother glances over proudly. At the hearth, 2 women warm flat stones on the edge of the fire. When the stones turn a soft glowing orange, they pull them away with long wooden tongs and wrap them in cloth. These are placed under beds, into blankets, even inside boots. You recall how often warm stones have appeared on this journey, and yet here the work behind them feels different. There is more care, more repetition, more urgency. One woman lifts a heavy quilt and shakes it gently. Dust rises in a soft plume. She inspects the seams, tugging each one to test its strength. Then she folds it carefully and slides it into a chest filled with bedding. She tells you that quilts never rest during winter. They rotate constantly, one on the bed, one airing by the fire, one patched at the table. Life moves in cycles, stitches and layers. A baby fusses in a cradle near the wall. A young mother scoops the child into her arms, wraps them in a thick swaddle of wool and begins rocking. She checks the baby's toes, pressing gently to ensure they are warm. She explains in a tired voice that infants lose heat quickly, so the women watch them often, even through the night. Her thumb strokes the wool as she rocks, her movements slow and instinctive. Across the table, a teenage girl sharpens shears. She glances at the window, noticing frost thickening on the edges of the glass. She adjusts the curtain, careful to tuck it behind a stack of folded blankets arranged as insulation. These little adjustments happen without thought. They form a silent language of survival. One woman shares a story about running out of thread in a storm. She unravels the hem of her own skirt to finish a coat for her brother. You see her gesture as she tells the story, tucking the end of a thread between her fingers. She laughs softly, but her eyes hold a trace of memory, of urgency, of cold, of a night that demanded sacrifice. A few steps away, another woman mixes soft herbs with grease, making a balm to rub onto cracked knuckles. She scoops a bit and offers it to you. It smells of pine and smoke. It soothes your skin instantly. She says they make a new batch each winter because cold air takes skin apart if allowed the chance. The women speak to one another in steady low tones. Questions, quick suggestions, reminders to check the hearth or move the drying cloth away from sparks. Their movements form a steady rhythm. The storm outside thunders against the walls, but inside there is a gentler storm of motion, quiet, constant, intentional. 2 women examine a tear in a winter coat. One holds the coat taut while the other stitches with strong, tight motions. They murmur about whether the repair will hold through the night. Their debate reminds you of something those who study frontier life often note. Existing documentation allows for several competing explanations regarding how much of winter survival depended on women's behind-the-scenes work. Some sources claim it was the backbone of household safety. Others speak of it in passing. Watching these women now, you see the truth with your own eyes. Their work fills the gaps the storm tries to exploit. One of them checks the oil in a lantern. Another sweeps stray snow from near the doorway. A girl rolls up a blanket and tucks it into a crate. A kettle is refilled. Needles are threaded. Seams are tightened. The room feels alive with purposeful motion. Eventually, someone spreads a large quilt near the hearth. Several women ease themselves down, still talking softly. The rest finish tasks and join them, pulling blankets over their shoulders. Their faces soften, their breaths deepen, but the room remains warm with lingering motion, with the quiet hum of people who have spent an entire day guarding their families from winter. You lie back beside the quilt, the warmth of the hearth brushing your cheek. The storm outside rages, but in this room the cold meets its match. Not through brute force, but through patience, precision, and tireless hands. Your eyelids grow heavy as the women's soft breathing blends with the crackle of the fire, and you drift into sleep wrapped in the quiet strength of those who mend warm stitch and tend the night into something survivable. You step back into the storm, leaving behind the steady hum of women's late-night labour. Snow washes over you in cold waves, whispering around your boots, as if guiding you somewhere familiar. Through the shifting white, you spot a narrow loft window, glowing with the faintest trace of lamplight. It flickers like a distant heartbeat. You move toward it, climbing a short rise, till a tiny homestead appears half buried beneath sculpted drifts. The front door opens with a long wooden sigh. and the family inside gestures for you to come in quickly before the wind steals too much heat. The warmth here is gentle, more fragile than the other places you have visited. A small stove sits in the centre of the room, burning modestly. Its glow fills the low rafters with a soft golden haze. On one side of the room, a ladder leads up to a loft. You hear small voices drifting down, children settling in for the night. The scent of drying wool, old books, and faint traces of cinnamon hangs in the air. You climb the ladder slowly, each rung creaking under your boots. At the top you find a cramped loft with bedding arranged in neat rows along the floorboards. Quilts of every colour and pattern lie piled in warm heaps. Some are patched with triangles, others with tiny squares. One quilt shows faded tulips stitched by careful hands. Another displays circles that catch the lantern light. Children peek at you from beneath them, their cheeks rosy from the heat rising from the stove below. Two little ones shift to make room for you. You settle near the edge, feeling the heat drift upward like the slow breath of the house. Blankets smell faintly of lye, soap, pine, and childhood. The patchwork patterns feel soft under your fingers, each piece sewn with deliberate care. Old fabrics, flower sack prints, worn dresses, scraps from outgrown shirts. Everything here carries a history. A mother climbs the ladder behind you, balancing another quilt over her arm. She spreads it across the children, tucking the edges carefully. As she works, she explains that quilts are more than covers. They are memory keepers, stitched during long winters and made to last. Weathered notes from family trunks reveal that many frontier children slept under quilts, sewn by grandmothers or older relatives. Their patterns a quiet record of lives lived through harsh seasons. You touch one of the squares. Its texture feels softer than its faded colours suggest. A young boy taps your arm and pulls his quilt up proudly, showing off a corner embroidered with tiny initials. He says his aunt stitched them as a secret good luck charm so he would sleep without fright on storm nights. A strange cold weather shortcut mentioned once in a faded notebook suggested that children slept better when quilts held such hidden messages. You smile, seeing how much comfort such small gestures carry. The loft is low enough that you can touch the rafters with your fingertips. Frost clings to the wood in pale crystals that glitter whenever the lantern flame wavers. A mother brushes them gently with a cloth, careful not to let them fall onto the quilts. The cold from the roof presses downward, but the thick bedding pushes back with patient warmth. A girl at the far end adjusts her spot, layering two quilts over her legs. She yawns, eyes half closed. She whispers that the loft is both the warmest and the coldest place in the house. Warm because heat rises, cold because the roof never fully keeps winter out. You feel that truth now, a subtle draft weaving across your cheek while heat gathers at your back. Near the ladder, one child arranges a small pile of books under his quilt. When you raise an eyebrow, he grins and explains that stacking books beneath the quilt's edge helps weigh it down, keeping drafts from sneaking under. A peculiar trick, but clever. He pats the stack proudly. A toddler crawls over, dragging a quilt behind them like a pet. The blanket is stitched with uneven shapes, some crooked, some bright, all soft from use. The child's mother retrieves it gently, wraps it around the toddler's shoulders, and whispers a lullaby as she rocks them. The loft fills with the soothing melody, soft and slow, stretching through the warm, dim air. The mother's voice blends with the faint wind outside in a way that makes both seem gentle. The father climbs halfway up the ladder and checks the stove below. He taps the iron door lightly, listening to the tone it makes. He nods satisfied, then lifts a small scoop of warm ash and sprinkles it around the base of the stove to keep stray draughts from bleeding into the main room. You hear the low crackle of embers as the stove settles again. Meanwhile, the children nestle closer, letting their quilts rise around them like small tents. A teenage girl finishes braiding her hair and lies back on a pillow stuffed with dried hay. She sighs and whispers that the storm will thicken before dawn. How she knows you're not certain, but her voice carries the quiet confidence of someone who has felt storms shift for years. The mother sits among the children, checking that each one has their quilt tucked properly. She smooths their hair, adjusts their socks, wiggles their fingers to ensure they are warm. She moves from one child to another with careful tenderness. You sense how deeply her presence shapes the safety of the room. In the corner, a boy traces the lines of a patchwork square with his finger, telling you it came from his father's old coat. Another patch came from a neighbour's skirt, another from a flour sack used during a year when food was scarce. He says each patch carries a story, and when he falls asleep he imagines the tales woven into the quilting threads. His voice drifts as he speaks, slowing, softening, blending with the lullaby echo. Down below, the stove pops softly, sending a gentle heat into the loft. The air warms your cheeks while cold collects quietly near the rafters. The quilts beneath you feel thick, welcoming, moulded by countless nights of children burrowing under them. Their weight settles comfortably over your legs. The storm outside shifts, making the roof creak slightly. Snow slides down the slanted boards with a slow, muffled sound. The children barely notice. This is their world, their night rhythm, their winter cradle. Experts sorting through these stories often come to opposing conclusions about how children perceive these harsh nights. Some believe frontier childhoods were defined by fear of the cold. Others argue that kids adapted so naturally they barely thought about it. Watching these children, now comfortable and calm within their quilted sanctuary, you feel the debate dissolve. What matters is the warmth created by care, familiarity, and layered patchwork. You rest your head against a folded quilt. Its softness welcomes you. The lantern's glow dims as someone turns the wick. Shadows spread across the loft in slow shapes. One child's quiet hum drifts upward, barely louder than breathing. Your eyes grow heavy. The quilts settle like warm sand over your body. The storm continues its muted growl beyond the window, but here inside this loft the night feels wrapped in colour and cotton and memory. You let your breath fall into the gentle rhythm of sleeping children, and you drift into warmth deep inside a patchwork sky stitched not overhead but all around you. You descend from the children's loft and step once more into the winter night, the storm meeting you with a restless swirl, as if testing your resolve. Snowflakes sting your cheeks and cling to your lashes. The darkness around you feels thick, rippling like fabric pulled tight. As you push forward across the silent plain, you begin to sense something different. Not warmth, not shelter. Something older, quieter, woven into the way the snow moves. A flicker of light ahead reveals a small homestead, its windows glowing faintly as if lit from deeper within the walls. As you approach, you feel the storm's roar soften as though the very air is pausing to listen. Inside, you find a handful of people gathered around a low table illuminated by a single oil lamp. The room is dim and slightly smoky. Every shadow seems to stretch with intention. The air smells of resin, smouldering herbs and wool warmed by bodies sitting close together. You nod in greeting as you slide into the room. The group falls quiet for a moment, then resumes conversation in hushed tones. They are discussing signs, shapes of cloud movement earlier in the day, strange patterns in the frost, the way the horses snorted before the wind shifted. Old winter accounts compiled by frontier families make it evident that storm-watching traditions held deep significance in isolated homesteads, shaping choices about when to sleep, when to gather neighbours, and how to prepare for the night ahead. You take a seat on a worn bench. A woman conducts a simple ritual near the hearth. She sprinkles a handful of dried juniper into the fire. A soft crackle follows, then a fragrant plume of smoke winds upward. A faint slice of folklore known only in a few circles describes how burning certain herbs was believed to confuse troublesome winter spirits so they could not creep into dreams. Whether the practice holds any truth or simply comforts the weary, it colours the room with a calming scent. A man points to the frost creeping along the interior edges of the window. It forms delicate branching shapes that resemble feathers trees or rivers. He explains that some families read these patterns as messages. If the frost leaned heavily to one side, it foretold stronger winds. If it formed spirals, it warned of sickness in the days ahead. A child traces a spiral now with a small finger, whispering a question about whether it means the storm will last through morning. A woman answers gently, offering an interpretation rooted in her grandmother's teachings. Another adult disagrees softly, suggesting the frost means something else entirely. Their exchange brings to mind how researchers assessing these accounts frequently disagree on how to understand such beliefs. Some see them as remnants of older cultural systems. Others consider them practical weather-reading techniques wrapped in story. Listening to the gentle disagreement, now you feel the value lies not in accuracy but in how these traditions knit people together. Someone invites you to place your hands near a bowl of warm stones sitting by the hearth. You hover your palms above them. The heat radiates upward in soft waves. The bowl is ringed with small carvings, spirals, diamonds, and river shapes etched by hand. A woman explains that these stones are set out each night not only for warmth, but because their steady presence reassures the youngest children that the house is grounded. She tells you that frightened little ones often sleep more peacefully if they fall asleep staring at the symbols. You glance at the stones again. Their carvings catch the lamplight glowing briefly like tiny lanterns. A small wooden box sits on a shelf above the hearth. Inside it are folded lengths of cord dyed with natural pigments. A young girl takes one out and ties it around a bundle of blankets, humming as she works. You ask about the cords. An elder answers that certain colours are believed to pull warmth inward or keep sickness outside. The meaning varies from family to family, but the intention remains steady. In the corner, a woman shakes a rattle made from dried gourd and small stones. Its sound is soft, rhythmic, almost hypnotic. She explains it is used during especially fierce storms to soothe those who cannot fall asleep, especially children afraid of the wind. The sound travels gently through the room, mingling with the hiss of burning juniper. Someone hands you a mug filled with warm water infused with pine needles. The stem rises in slow curls. Its scent clears your head and warms your lungs. The man who offered it tells you that drinking pine infusion at night helps strengthen the body during cold spells. You sip it slowly, feeling the warmth settle in your throat. A soft knock sounds at the door. A neighbour steps inside, brushing snow from his hat. He carries a small pouch of dried berries and places it on the table without a word. The room brightens with recognition. He sits quietly to join the discussion. The storm pushes against the walls, but inside the mood grows more intimate, more anchored. Children sit close to the adults, listening to the stories of storm signs and omens. They learn when to trust the wind, when to watch for certain animal behaviours, when to gather supplies. They absorb the wisdom quietly, as if learning the weather itself is part of their inheritance. A man describes how earlier in the day he noticed a ring around the sun. He believes it warned of the storm that now shakes the shutters. The others nod, though one woman counters that the ring predicted only cold, not wind. Their voices remain respectful, gentle. This world allows multiple truths to coexist because survival leaves room for interpretation. A candle flickers suddenly, its flame bending sharply. Everyone glances toward the window. The wind has shifted. Someone mutters that dawn may bring heavier snowfall. The elder shakes her head. She interprets the shift differently. The girl with the cord bites her lip, trying to decide which view she prefers. The debate, such as it is, breathes softness rather than tension. It feels like a shared language spoken in analogies, memories and patterns traced in frost and flame. Soon the group begins preparing for sleep. They spread blankets on the floor-layer furs near the hearth and position the bowl of warm stones where the smallest children can reach. You lie down among them on a patch of soft wool, the blankets heavy and comforting. The juniper smoke thins, the rattled rhythm fades, the frost on the window grows thicker. Your breath slows. The shelter hums with old stories and quiet superstition, with warmth shaped not only by fire but by memory and community. And as the storm murmurs around the walls, you drift into a sleep touched by prayers patterns and whispered signs carried across countless winters. You step back into the storm, feeling the cold clamp down on your lungs the moment you inhale. The wind spins sideways now, as if it has changed its mind about which direction to attack from. You stagger through the white, following a dim, flickering lantern hanging outside a low cabin. The storm seems oddly quiet for a moment, as though holding its breath. When you reach the door and push it open, you enter a space where the air feels strangely heavy, warm and scented with cedar-boiled water and something metallic. Someone is sick inside. The family greets you quietly. Their movements are slow, purposeful and careful, as if sound itself might disturb the fragile balance of the room. In the corner, A man lies on a cot layered with quilts. His breath comes in shallow puffs. His skin shines with a faint sheen of sweat despite the cold outside. A kettle simmers on the stove and steam rises, slowly filling the room with thick, moist warmth that clings to every surface. You take a seat near the stove. A woman ladles hot water into a bowl and adds crushed herbs, stirring until the steam sharpens with a medicinal scent. She carries the bowl to the sick man, holding it under his face so he can breathe the fragrant vapours. Temperature logs scribbled in early almanacs indicate clearly that winter illnesses surged whenever storms trapped families indoors, turning simple coughs into dangerous episodes when warmth and airflow grew scarce. You watch quietly as she adjusts the quilt around his shoulders. Her movements are soft but meticulous. Another woman boils a cloth, wrings it out with steady hands and lays it across his forehead. The heat makes his skin glisten. The air grows thick, humid, almost soothing. A child sits near the hearth, grinding dried roots with a small stone pestle. She does it with determination far beyond her years. When she notices you watching, she explains in a whisper that the mixture helps clear the lungs. Her mother nods approvingly, but warns the girl not to grind too finely or the powder will become bitter. Near the window hangs a string of dried leaves. A playful bit of superstition passed among isolated families claimed that hanging certain plants near sleeping patients distracted harmful winter spirits. Whether or not anyone truly believed this, the sight of the leaves swaying gently each time the wind rattles, the shutters brings a surprising comfort to the room. A man sitting at the table pours a small cup of warm broth and hands it to you. It tastes earthy and thin, but it spreads warmth through your chest. He confides that the sick man overworked himself tending animals in the cold earlier that week. Winter punishes carelessness, he says, voice low. His eyes linger on the man in the corner with worry hidden beneath calm resignation. Another child coughs softly nearby, and a woman quickly ushers her closer to the stove. She checks the girl's forehead, relieved to find it cool. You notice how the adults keep watch constantly, their eyes flicking from one family member to another, assessing warmth, breath, colour. Health becomes a nightly vigil in seasons like this. A pot of water boils vigorously on the stove and someone tosses in pine needles, letting the sharp scent cut through the room's heaviness. The steam rises in long ribbons. It fills your lungs with warmth each time you breathe. A quiet moment falls as everyone listens to the sick man's breaths. Shallow, then a little deeper, then shallow again. A neighbour arrives, brushing snow from his shoulders. He brings a small jar of something thick and dark. He places it on the table without ceremony. Inside is a homemade syrup made from honey herbs and melted animal fat. He murmurs that it should ease coughing. The family accepts it gratefully, stirring a spoonful into a cup of warm water for the patient. The storm presses hard against the outer walls. The shutters tremble. Snow accumulates in the window corners. Yet inside the air feels soft and saturated with warmth, like a cocoon spun from steam and breath. The family begins to talk about another storm years ago when sickness swept through the valley. Their voices remain low, respectful of the sleeping man. A woman recounts how her sister burned sage every night to keep the air moving. Another adds that they filled every crack in the cabin walls to keep out draughts, but in doing so trapped stale air that worsened illness. This memory brings to mind how existing documentation leaves multiple plausible readings of how families balanced insulation with ventilation during harsh winter sickness. Some seem to understand airflow intuitively. Others unknowingly made the air heavier, warmer and harder to breathe. The man on the cot stirs. His eyes flicker open, then close again. His breathing remains shallow. A woman beside him hums a soft melody, smoothing his hair with gentle strokes. The song is rhythmic, almost like a lullaby meant to calm not only him but everyone listening. Someone places heated stones wrapped in cloth near the foot of the cot to keep his legs warm. Another adjusts the damp cloth on his forehead, replaces it with one freshly warmed in the kettle. The room becomes a slow dance of caregiving, each movement deliberate and quiet. The steam from the stove continues to rise, filling the air with a comforting haze. You inhale deeply. your own lungs open slightly warmed by the dense herb-filled vapour. Outside, the wind shrieks, but inside the sounds soften, muffled by quilts, steam, and human breath. Her mother checks her children again, ensuring each one is warm, fed, and calm. She touches each forehead lightly, nodding to herself. Her vigilance feels like a shield against the storm. The lamp flickers near the window, its flame bending as a gust presses against the shutters. A few snowflakes slip through a crack, melting instantly on the hot stove. Someone moves to stuff cloth into the gap. Gradually the family settles. Some sit near the stove, others curl beneath blankets spread along the floor. The sick man's breathing steadies into a faint but predictable rhythm. You lie down near a pile of folded quilts, the warmth around you almost heavy. The scent of pine-warm cloth and boiled herbs fills your nose. Your eyelids begin to droop. The storm becomes a distant heartbeat. The breathing of the family weaves into a quiet chorus around you, and as the patient murmurs softly in his sleep and the frost thickens on the window, you drift into a night shaped by care-worry steam and the fragile warmth that keeps illness at bay in the heart of winter. You leave the sick room behind, with its humid warmth still clinging faintly to your skin. Outside, the storm lets out a low rolling growl as though displeased to see you walking freely again. You brace yourself against the wind and push forward until the faint outline of another homestead rises from the dark. The house behind those walls feels different the moment you step inside. Quieter, sparser. A single lantern glows on a table, and the air carries the smell of cooling coals and damp wool hung near the door. No one speaks. They are listening to the night. You take a seat near the hearth as a family moves around you with slow, deliberate gestures. A father checks the shutters. A teenager rolls a blanket tightly and sets it beside the wall. A mother sits with her hands wrapped around a mug, her eyes half closed but alert. And upstairs, through the cracks of the loft boards, you hear shifting footsteps and soft whispers. This household sleeps in rhythms you've not witnessed before. Not the deep single block of rest you know, something more broken, more fluid, something shaped by winter itself. A man invites you to sit closer to the stove. He explains that sleep here comes in fragments, never in one stretch. Old community archives point sharply to a pattern of interrupted rest across frontier winters, where families often drifted into 2 or 3 separate sleeping periods each night, guided by chores, weather shifts, and the need to tend fires. Looking around, you sense that pattern unfolding even now. The mother stands and moves quietly through the room, blowing out all but one lantern. She glances at the shutter again, then at the stove, then at the children who settle onto a long mattress layered with quilts. They nestle like quiet animals beneath thick fabric. Her steps are soft, almost rhythmic, as if she's guiding the room toward its first sleep of the night. A small box of dried lavender and mint sits on a shelf. She crushes a bit between her fingers, letting the scent drift across the room. A delicate oddity mentioned just once in a traveller's note recounts that some families believed that fragrant herbs encouraged smoother waking during the long cold night, making it easier to rise for chores or fire tending. The mother doesn't mention this yet, her motions carry a quiet familiarity. The father stretches out on a pallet near the stove where he can feed the fire without fully rising. He checks the iron door, listens to the crackle, and adjusts the dampers with a careful hand. Soon he lies down, but his posture remains half ready, as though one ear stays tuned to the storm, the livestock, the faint creak of the walls. Above you, the teenagers settle in the loft. They murmur about the wind, about the animals in the barn, about the faint whistle in the eaves. Their voices fade gradually. The storm outside rises and falls like a giant breathing against the house. For a moment, everything becomes still, and then the first sleep takes hold. The room shifts into a dreaming quiet, yet it is not complete silence. The father stirs. The children sigh under the quilts. The mother hums faintly as she folds cloth on the table. Even in sleep, the homestead feels aware. You lie back on a folded blanket offered to you. The warmth of the room is uneven, rising in pockets from the stove and drifting cold from the walls. Your breath forms faint clouds in the dimness. Your mind floats, not fully asleep, not fully awake. Time becomes soft, then slowly you notice the rhythm change again. Someone rises, the father first lifting himself from the pallet with the heaviness of someone used to partial nights. He stokes the fire, the scrape of the poker echoing softly. Sparks flutter behind the grate. He warms his hands, checks the window, listens to the wind. He stands there for a long moment before lying down again. The mother wakes next. She checks the children's quilts, tightening the corners. She taps one child's shoulder gently, making sure the little one turns over so limbs don't go stiff in the cold. She sits back at the table, taking slow sips of the herbal drink from earlier. This is the second rhythm of the night. You sit up slightly, watching how the house breathes. Surviving winter requires attention, even while the body longs for rest. The mother stretches her hands toward the ceiling, working out stiffness. The teenagers upstairs murmur again, then fall quiet. An infant whimpers softly and settles after one soothing whisper from the loft. The father shifts again, half waking. His voice is groggy as he asks whether the wind has changed. She answers yes, and he sighs. The shift means snow is piling differently. He might need to clear the doorway by dawn. Researchers analysing this kind of household pattern often propose contrasting interpretations of these fragmented nights. Some believe the broken sleep was driven entirely by labour demands. Others suggest it produced a kind of calm alertness, uniquely suited to frontier survival. Watching these two adults move through their quiet duties, neither fully asleep nor fully awake, you sense truth in both ideas. A small lantern still flickers on the table. Its flame dips low, then lifts. Shadows move in slow waves across the walls. A draft circles your ankles. You pull the blanket higher. After a while, the mother lies down to curling under a quilt near her children. The room dims into shadow again. You listen as the house returns to stillness. This becomes the second sleep. A quiet, gentle sinking deeper than the first, but still cautious. The father shifts one more time, then settles. The teenagers breathe steadily overhead. Even the storm seems softer, as though the night has entered its own pause. You feel your own body slipping into that same rhythm, drawn into a state that is neither fully here nor fully gone. The warmth of the blanket steadies you. The quiet hum of the wind and the fire blends into a single soothing sound. Your thoughts drift, settle, drift again. Much later, though time has become soft and hard to measure, the father rises once more. This time he checks the barn door from the window. The mother listens without waking. A faint creak from the loft suggests one child has shifted position. The fire pops. Embers glow brighter. This is how winter nights pass here, in waves of half-waking, tending, sleeping, stirring, resting, listening. Life woven into the hours like threads in a quilt. You close your eyes again. The second sleep folds around you like warm cloth. Somewhere outside, snow slides from the roof in a muffled rush. Inside, the house holds fast, wrapped in its own rhythm. And you drift into that rhythm with it, letting the frontier night rock you gently between waking and dreaming, between duty and rest, until the darkness feels almost kind. You step back outside, and the storm rushes at you with the force of a wild animal startled awake. The cold clings to your eyelashes, settling into tiny crystals as you walk. But soon as you crest a small rise, the wind changes tone. Not quieter exactly, just different. Sharper in some places, softer in others. Through the storm's drifting white, you begin to pick out faint shapes, fence posts leaning like tired sentinels, the silhouette of a shed half buried in snow, and finally a low house whose shutters tremble under the night's weight. This place feels steeped in listening, in sound. You move closer, drawn by that sense of watchfulness. Inside, the warmth is subdued but steady. A single lantern glows on a wooden shelf. The family sits scattered across the main room, each wrapped in quilts or coats. And you can tell almost immediately that they are not resting. They are listening. The children stare at the door. The father leans slightly toward the windows. The mother sits near the stove with her hands still, as if moving them might disrupt the air. The house is tuned to the noises of the night. You take a seat, and one child quietly informs you that winter nights talk differently than summer ones. You tilt your head and hear it now, the high whine of wind threading through a tiny gap in the frame, the soft clatter of sleet tumbling from shingles, the distant eerie yip of a coyote drifting through the storm like a half-remembered dream. A handful of well-preserved winter diaries provide unmistakable testimony that families sometimes relied on these sounds as early warning systems, using them to decide whether to stay awake, check livestock, or brace the door against drifting snow. The father lifts a finger suddenly. Everyone falls silent. A faint thump echoes from the barn. He nods, relieved, murmuring that it is only a restless horse shifting its weight. When he explains it to you, his tone carries a familiar kind of winter wisdom. Animals tell their own snowy stories, and good listeners stay ahead of danger. A small girl sits near your side, hugging a quilt patterned with stars. She whispers that on nights like this she pretends each sound is a character in a bedtime tale. She tells you the wind is the old whistler, the stove is the red-bellied dragon, and the ticking wallboards are timber mice. Her naming might be childish, but her mother nods. A tiny scrap of winter lore passed down informally hints that giving names to night noises helps children distinguish between ordinary sounds and those that signal real danger. You watch the girl press her ear to her quilt with practiced concentration. Her imagination blends seamlessly with a survival tactic. A sudden creak races along the rafters. The teenager in the corner straightens, then relaxes. "Just the roof settling," he says quietly. The snow is heavy tonight. You hear it too. A low groaning, then a soft sliding sound as snow shifts across the shingles. The noise feels ancient, like the house exhaling. Next, something bangs lightly against the wall, not hard enough to frighten, but enough to raise eyebrows. The mother stands, retrieves a lantern, and checks the inside of the door frame. A loose board rattles in the wind. She secures it with a wooden wedge and returns to her seat. The storm answers with another round of irregular tapping. This time, the family ignores it. Not all noises hold meaning. A whisper floats down from the loft, a child asking if the coyotes sound closer tonight. The father listens carefully, his expression thoughtful. He says the calls are drifting, not advancing. His reassurance carries weight. The children settle again, nestling deeper beneath their blankets. You notice a curious object hanging near the window, a string of metal spoons tied with thin rope. You ask about it. The mother smiles gently and says they rattle if the wind shifts sharply, acting like a crude warning bell. The spoons clink softly now, chiming out little hints of the changing night. She adjusts them so they will not clatter too loudly. Good to hear, she murmurs, but not so much you cannot sleep. Nearby the fire snaps audibly. Sparks skitter in the stove. The sound is oddly comforting, a steady reminder of heat battling the cold. The oldest son taps the stovepipe lightly, listening to the hollow thrum. He explains that the sound changes when creosote builds up. If it dulls too much, they clean it to keep the draft clear. An ordinary chore, but one bound tightly to winter safety. Outside, the storm shifts again. Now it produces a low, wide hum like a distant organ. The father tilts his head, brow furrowing. He mutters something under his breath. When you ask, he explains that this tone means the wind is sweeping across the valley, pushing drifts into deeper piles. By morning, he says we may be snowed in. The mother nods and begins preparing extra blankets, wrapping them around the cracks near the door. The children fall quiet, studying the floorboards as if they too can read the storm's direction. You recall how interpretations of sound often differed widely across families. Historical interpretations of this practice have diverged sharply due to sparse documentation, leaving some to believe these sound readings were highly intuitive, while others argue they were little more than educated guesses. Listening to this family tonight, the distinction seems unnecessary. They treat the noises as familiar signals, trusted companions in winter's long conversation. A faint scrape comes from under the house. A child stiffens. The mother smiles softly and says, "Just the old board shrinking in the cold." She taps her foot lightly against the floor, letting the vibration carry comfort. The little one relaxes instantly. You marvel at how finely tuned everyone is to the subtleties of the night. Another coyote call echoes faintly. The father says it is nothing to worry about. But then you hear something else, an eerie, hollow whistling that seems to slither along the outer wall. The room stiffens for a heartbeat. The oldest son rises, peers through the frost-stained window, then shakes his head. Only the wind curling over the ridge, he decides. The family exhales together. Gradually the house grows warmer. The storm outside continues its unpredictable chorus, but the interior hums in a calmer register. The children yawn. One curls against your arm blanket pulled high. Another falls asleep mid-sentence. The mother brushes hair from her forehead. The father checks the stove one last time, nodding in satisfaction. Then the room settles into a kind of listening sleep. Not completely unconscious, but gently aware, as if each person is willing to wake at the slightest shift in sound. You rest your head on a folded quilt. The wind sings along the rafters. The spoons clink once, then fall still. Coyotes call again from afar. The stove murmurs like an old friend. The house speaks. The storm answers. The family breathes. And in that layered symphony of winter night sounds, you drift into a soft, receptive slumber, trusting the dialogue of the dark to keep watch until morning. You leave the listening house and step into the storm as it shifts yet again, its voice rising and falling, like a creature learning new ways to growl. Snow swirls around you in restless spirals. The air bites sharp and metallic as you walk across a stretch of land where the wind seems determined to erase your footprints. But ahead, barely visible beneath the storm's white churn, you notice a line of fences, a cluster of low roofs, and the unmistakable shapes of livestock moving nervously in the night. You're approaching a ranch where winter rest is shaped entirely by the animals' needs. A ranch hand waves you inside a long low building that smells of hay, warm animal musk and damp wool fresh from the snow. Lanterns hang from wooden beams and the room radiates uneven warmth from bodies human and animal crowded together against the storm's force. A few sheep huddle near a makeshift pen. A dog sleeps curled by the feed sacks. Horses stamp intermittently, their breath thick in the air. The rancher nods to you while fastening his coat tighter. He explains that tonight will offer only slivers of sleep. An assortment of travel notebooks from the period consistently remarks that ranch families often slept in fragments during deep storms, keeping half an ear open for any sign of distress among their animals. As if on cue, a low uneasy groan rises from the barnyard outside and he stiffens, listening, analysing the sound with practised attention. Nearby, a woman checks a pile of blankets set aside for the night. Some are spread across makeshift sleeping spots in the corner. Others are reserved for wrapping newborn calves should any be born during the storm. She runs her fingers across the wool, lifting and arranging each piece as though preparing for an unpredictable guest. In the far corner, a teenage girl warms her hands over a small bucket filled with hot stones wrapped in cloth. She explains that these stones help calm shaking animals, and sometimes even soothe frightened children. A nearly forgotten fireside belief among a few settlers maintained that placing a warm stone beneath a restless calf helped it remember its mother's breath. Whether practical truth or tender imagination, the girl's expression shows she believes in the comfort it brings. The storm thunders again, this time with a hollow echo that vibrates the walls. Everyone looks toward the door where the cold leaks through the cracks. A ranch hand mutters that the drifts will be high by morning. He throws another plank across the entrance to slow the worst of the wind. A horse neighs sharply from outside. The rancher grabs a lantern and heads toward the barn, signalling for you to follow if you wish. Inside the barn is a sanctuary of shifting shadows and warm breath. The animals huddle close their flanks, rising in steady motions. One cow stamps repeatedly, nervous. The rancher strokes her neck, whispering something calm. He checks the hay, the ropes, the temperature near the animals' muzzles. Each gesture carries the precision of someone who knows lives depend on these small rituals. When he is satisfied, you return with him to the main shelter. He removes his gloves and sits heavily on a stool, rubbing his forehead, as though clearing snow from his thoughts. The woman hands him a cup of warm broth, and he drinks half of it in a single swallow. The teenage girl kneels near the dog, inspecting its paws for ice build-up. She murmurs gently and the dog sighs, relaxing. She wraps a small blanket around its back, tucking the edges behind its ears. The animal settles, though its ears flick at each gust of wind rattling the shutters. One of the ranch hands begins to doze while sitting upright. His head tilts forward, then jerks back. His fingers twitch with lingering adrenaline. The rancher nudges him awake with a small smile, but offers no reprimand. This house knows exhaustion intimately. They pass around a kettle of hot water, sipping in turns. The woman begins arranging sleeping places. She spreads blankets in 2 long rows, placing a heated stone at the foot of each. She checks that the lanterns have enough oil. She secures cloth against the tiniest cracks in the walls, pausing to listen for drafts. She arranges bedding so every spot rests near enough to the animal's steady warmth, but not too close to risk being stepped on if something startles them. As she works, she tells you quietly that storms like these create an uneasy balance. The cold is dangerous, but so is the silence of a barn. A sleeping family can miss signs of trouble. A restless steer can injure itself. A cow giving birth can lose heat too quickly. So we sleep, she says, but always lightly. She gestures to the rancher who now lies beside the stove. His eyes are half closed, but his hand rests on the lantern handle, as though ready to lift it instantly if a sound breaks the night. A low rumble rolls across the land, something bumps against the barn wall. The teenage girl straightens, listening. The rancher opens one eye. The sound fades. He closes his eyes again. You nestle onto your blanket in a quiet corner. Warmth reaches you in uneven waves, the dog's soft breathing, the stove's low whisper, the rustle of hay each time a horse shifts. Somewhere overhead, snow slides from the roof in a soft cascade. In the dim light, you notice a thin string running across the ceiling, tied from beam to beam. Small pieces of wool dangle from it, barely moving. You ask about it. The woman says it's a simple indicator. If a sudden draft blows strong enough to lift the wool pieces, they know a window or board has failed somewhere. It is an improvised alarm built from necessity rather than design. The ranch hand, who nearly fell asleep earlier, lies down fully now, pulling a blanket to his chin. He sighs with a tiredness so deep it seems to melt into the floor. Another worker leans against a hay bale, already asleep with his mouth slightly open. The teenage girl sits cross-legged with her back to the wall, eyelids fluttering. You can almost see sleep arriving in slow waves, touching each person gently, and then retreating whenever the animals snort or the wind growls too loudly. At last the rancher dims the lantern. The light shrinks to a warm dot before settling into a steady glow. The storm outside rumbles, but the animals hum their own chorus of breath, grounding the night. The inconsistent reports left by those who lived this life give no single reading of how rest truly felt in such places. Some accounts describe constant anxiety. Others describe a strange, peaceful rhythm born from shared purpose with the animals. Listening to the slow, steady breaths around you now, it feels close to the latter. You lie back, warmth rising from the blankets beneath you. The voices of the night blend together. A horse snorts. The wind booms, a lantern wick crackles, someone sighs, your own breath eases into the rhythm, and slowly, gently, with the storm circling the ranch like a restless guardian, you drift into sleep in the company of humans and animals keeping watch over one another through the long winter dark. You step back into the storm, letting the ranch's mingled warmth and worry fall behind you. The wind claws across the land, now picking up loose snow and hurling it sideways in shimmering sheets. Your steps grow slower as you wade through drifts nearly to your knees. Then through the thick swirl you see a cluster of lights glowing in small, wavering halos. They blink irregularly like stars seen through heavy clouds. As you draw closer, you realize they mark a winter night, gathering at the home of a few scattered neighbors' families who visit one another not for celebration, but for company strong enough to push back the storm. Inside the cabin, warmth and voices fold around you instantly. A long table sits near the wall, and around it several adults speak in low tones while children drift in and out of blankets arranged in patches across the floor. A cast-iron stove radiates a steady, comforting heat. The air is thick with the smell of warming bread, faint lantern smoke and wool drying beside the hearth. Someone hands you a cup of warm cider. You sip slowly, feeling the heat pool beneath your ribs. On the wall hangs a hand-drawn map of the valley marked with each family's homestead. A man taps a point on it, and mutters that the storm will keep everyone here until daylight. His voice carries no frustration, only an acceptance born from years of winter's unpredictability. Several contemporary winter logs kept near the Plains districts report that neighbours commonly spent whole nights together when storms crowded the sky, using shared presence as both comfort and defence against isolation. Two women sit near the stove hemming a blanket together. Their needles move with smooth precision, passing through cloth with tiny sure motions. They talk quietly about who has enough flour, which family lost fence posts last week, and whether the creek will freeze fully by morning. Their conversation flows like a warm current beneath the larger hush of the room. Near the door sits a woven basket filled with small objects, marbles, wooden figures, scraps of cloth and little bags of dried berries tied shut with twine. A child reaches into the basket and pulls out a tiny wooden horse, polished smooth by countless hands. She presses it into your palm. Her grandmother explains that each visiting family leaves a small comfort object for nights like these, a long-standing tradition in their valley. A nearly forgotten domestic recollection spoken only in remote households proposed that exchanging such little tokens brought good sleep to children resting far from home. A man seated by the window listens intently to the storm. He comments on the wind's shift, the distant thumps of settling snow, and the faint crack the roof made earlier. A debate begins among the adults about whether the storm is weakening or gathering strength. One insists the low, hollow sound in the gusts signals an approaching lull. Another believes the sky is preparing to drop more snow by dawn. The inconsistent accounts preserved from similar gatherings show how winter reading varied dramatically from person to person, each voice offering a different interpretation shaped by memory, instinct, or fear. Tonight's conversation follows that familiar pattern. In a corner, two older neighbours trade stories about winters long past. One tells of a night when snow piled so deep against the door that they had to climb out a window to free it at dawn. The other describes how once during a storm a lantern's flame bent sideways and would not straighten for hours, convincing the children that spirits were visiting. The listeners smile, not dismissing the tales, but treating them like necessary threads in the fabric of winter memory. A newborn calf lies wrapped in a quilt near the stove, its breath soft and steady. Someone brought it from a nearby homestead earlier in the evening when the cold threatened its survival. Now it sleeps with surprising peace, tiny ears flicking whenever logs crackle in the firebox. The children begin arranging themselves into sleeping piles on the floor. They build nests from quilts and blankets, sharing warmth with cheerful practicality. You notice how naturally they do it, as if such nights are woven into their childhoods. Two boys debate who gets the warmest corner nearest the stove until their mother gently settles the matter by placing them side by side. Overhead, the wind shrieks in a long rising pitch, then drops suddenly into a low rumble. The adults quiet again, listening. A man at the table tilts his head and suggests the storm might be circling rather than moving on. A woman counters that the change in tone means the snow will ease. Experts reviewing accounts of these gatherings continue to dispute the significance of such sound interpretations. Some argue they held genuine practicality. Others believe they reflected emotional reassurance more than meteorology. Watching the calm faces around you, it seems possible both are true. A pot of stew sits on a trivet near the fire, its aroma rich and warm. Several neighbours take slow, thoughtful sips from wooden bowls. Someone passes you a ladleful. The stew's heat spreads instantly through your chilled limbs. You feel life settle back into your fingertips. The room dims as lantern wicks are lowered. A soft glow remains, casting warm pools of light across faces and blankets. Snow taps lightly at the window. The storm outside no longer sounds violent, more like a tired visitor lingering on the doorstep. One neighbour begins humming, and the melody drifts gently through the quieting room. A few voices join in, soft and almost breath-like. The tune circles the cabin like a warm current, soothing and slow. Families arrange themselves for rest. Adults lean against walls or settle onto quilts. Children curl like kittens in shared piles. The calf gives one soft bleat, then quiets again. The stove breathes steady heat. You lie down on a wide quilt patterned with fading blues and greens. It smells faintly of winter air and pine smoke. A child beside you sighs and tucks her cold toes under the edge of the blanket. Someone's hand pats your shoulder in a gesture so instinctive it feels like home. Gradually, the hum of voices disappears. The storm continues its low moaning rhythm, but inside the warmth thickens until sleep settles easily. You close your eyes, listening to the breath of the gathered neighbours, the soft rustle of quilts, and the steady protective heartbeat of a winter night shared. And slowly wrapped in calm voices and gentle heat, you drift into a deep communal slumber. You leave the neighbour-filled cabin behind, stepping once more into a storm that flings itself across the land in long, icy sweeps. Snowflakes sting your cheeks like fine gravel. The wind howls past your ears, swirling in tight spirals that tug at your coat. You push forward across a ridge following a faint glow just visible through the shifting white. It flickers irregularly, rising and falling as though someone is shielding a lantern with their hands. As you draw nearer, the shape of a small homestead emerges, its shutters rattling, its roof groaning under the weight of fresh drifts. And then you sense it, something caught ahead. Something trapped. When you reach the door, it is wedged against a bank of snow nearly as tall as you. A man inside calls out, voice muffled. You push. The door barely moves. He pushes back from the other side. Together, leaning shoulder to wood, you manage to swing it open wide enough for you to slip inside before it slams shut again under the storm's pressure. The interior is dim, lit only by a single lantern on a small table. The room smells of churned earth from the storm-damp coats drying and iron pots still warm from supper. The family stands clustered near the window, their faces lined with concern. Snow has piled nearly to the sill. The glass bows inward under the steady push of the wind. A large broom leans against the wall, a tool you recognise instantly. Weather summaries collected by early settlers outline that homes often required round-the-clock clearing during heavy storms, so that drifting snow did not seal the family indoors completely. The father points toward a small gap where the shutters meet the frame. A faint draught cuts through the room. He mutters that the snow climbs faster than he can shovel. The mother wraps a blanket around her shoulders and says they cannot risk opening the door again. It took nearly 10 minutes to close it. On the floor near the wall lies a long board wrapped in canvas strips. A little boy tells you shyly that it's the pushing plank. He demonstrates how they wedge it between the door and the snowdrift, so the drifting weight doesn't crush the frame. The idea seems surprisingly clever. A modest winter oddity mentioned in a cracked notebook hints at the same trick families would repurpose leftover lumber as temporary supports whenever drifts threaten to break in doors. Snow thumps heavily against the outside wall. The lantern flickers with each impact. The father moves to the window and taps gently on the pane. It responds with a faint hollow sound. He presses his ear to the glass. His shoulders loosen slightly. The drift isn't fully frozen yet, he says. If it were, the sound would be sharper, more brittle. He returns to the table and begins sketching in the dust with his fingertip. A quick tally of how often the door must be checked, how soon the weight outside becomes too heavy. A teenage girl kneels near the hearth, warming her hands over a shallow metal pan filled with hot stones wrapped in cloth. She explains that the stones are for placing along the base of the door and the window frame. It gives the wood enough warmth to resist warping under pressure. You marvel at how many simple, clever techniques families relied on to outsmart winter's strength. The mother rummages through a small chest by the wall, pulling out lengths of tow rope. She knots them and threads them through the handles of the window shutters, tightening them toward the interior beams. She mutters that the rope held last winter, so it should hold again. You help her wrap another length around an exposed support post. Outside, the storm roars. Inside the house becomes a quiet workshop of preparation. Each person performs small tasks in practiced rhythm. Father checks the doorframe again. The mother inspects the rope. The teenage girl nudges the hot stones closer to the sill. The boy holds his plank ready like a knight's shield. Suddenly a low groan shudders through the wall. Everyone freezes. The father steps toward the window. Snow slides slow but heavy, pressing harder against the frame. He listens closely. His brow furrows. The girl whispers that if the drift rises above the window, they will need to dig from the inside outward, a nearly impossible task. He turns to you, voice low, and says the storm may trap them until morning. You feel the weight of the night settle into the room. Heat gathers near the stove, but the storm presses from every direction, like a beast pacing its cage. A woman, perhaps a visiting aunt, sits on a bench near the table. She tells a soft story about a winter long ago when the storm buried their entire cabin up to the chimney. Her voice is smooth, almost soothing. She says her father kept everyone calm by tapping on the walls and listening to how the snow packed. If it thudded flat, help was near. If it echoed hollow, they could still dig. If it sounded sharp, the drift had frozen solid, and they'd need to wait it out. Those who study frontier routines have yet to reconcile differing views on whether such sound readings were truly reliable or simply comforting rituals born of necessity. But watching the family now, you sense how powerfully those rituals hold the night together. The room grows quieter as the storm intensifies. Snow begins to press more firmly against the shutters, causing the lantern's flame to waver. The father lights a second lantern, placing it near the window to monitor movement. Its glow reflects off the frost inside the glass, creating silver ridges. One by one, family members arrange themselves on blankets near the centre of the room, where the warmth gathers most easily. They keep their backs away from the walls where cold creeps in. The teenage girl lays the hot stones along the doorframe and windowsill. The little boy places his pushing plank beside him like a treasured tool. The mother sets a heavy quilt across everyone's legs. Its warmth flows through the room in gentle waves. She checks the father's face, reading his worry as easily as lantern shadows. Still she smiles softly, reassuring him. You lie down among them, feeling the warmth of shared bodies and the hum of their breath. The storm outside growls. The house gives a low shudder as snow shifts again, but the room holds. The ropes hold, the plank holds, the people hold. Slowly the family's breathing steadies, the lantern light dims, the storm snarls but seems slightly less vicious now that so many hands have prepared against it. You close your eyes, sinking into the soft quilt, the warm stones and the faint sound of snow settling against the walls, and soon, held in the quiet determination of a house braced against the storm, you drift into a peaceful, sheltered sleep. You step out of the drift-pressed homestead and into a storm that has grown stranger in its music. The wind no longer simply howls. It moans in long, uneven phrases as though the land itself is speaking through it. Snow lifts from the ground in twisting columns, dancing away before your boots even touch it. As you push onward, you see a faint light ahead, warm, golden, irregular. You move toward it until a small sod house emerges from the swirling dark, its roof rounded with packed earth and its chimney barely visible beneath thick frost. You knock, and the door opens to reveal a room dimly lit by a single lamp. Inside, the air feels different, denser, earthier, almost insulated by the soil itself. A woman ushers you in quickly. Behind her, several people sit near a low hearth, built directly into the packed wall. Their blankets drape over shoulders and knees. Their faces glow with a soft mix of lamplight and warmth, radiating from stone-lined coals. Someone hands you a warm cloth to wipe your face. The room smells of damp earth wood smoke, warm porridge cooling in a bowl, and a faint trace of drying herbs hanging from the rafters. A young man explains that this sod house sleeps warmer than any timber cabin in storms like this. Rural correspondence preserved from the decade makes apparent that such homes often held heat remarkably well, thanks to the thick layers of grass roots and soil that wrap the walls like a natural quilt. You take a seat on a small wooden stool. The woman beside you pokes at the coals with a curved stick, making them glow brighter. Their steady heat fills the room with a gentle, even warmth that seems to thicken the air. She places a pot of water closer to the embers so steam begins drifting upward, softening the dryness of the storm day. Near the door sits a small basket filled with smooth, rounded stones. A child proudly tells you they're pocket warmers. He demonstrates by tucking one wrapped in fabric into his coat. A slender thread of local folklore murmured among older families suggests that stones gathered from riverbeds held warmth longer, as though they remembered sunlight. He smiles as he hands one to you, its heat reaching through the cloth like a small heartbeat. A man adjusts the frame of the door, stuffing handfuls of dried grass into the cracks where cold air tries to pry its way inside. The sod walls mute the storm so completely that the wind's roar becomes a far-off sigh, but the family remains vigilant. Everyone seems to listen for subtle shifts, the kind of sounds only those who live in earthen homes truly understand. One woman near the hearth shows you a clever trick. She lifts a flat stone heated by the fire and places it under the centre of a large quilt, letting the warmth spread outward. Then the family folds themselves around it like petals around a flower. You feel the heat radiate in gentle pulses, drawing you closer. Above your head, ropes hold bundles of drying grass and herbs. They sway slightly each time the wind bumps the sod roof. The room creaks in slow, low groans that sound organic, almost alive. The house feels less like a structure and more like a hill breathing gently in its sleep. A teenage boy kneels near a low table carving a piece of scrap wood. He holds it up proudly. It is shaped like a small bird wings tucked at its sides. He explains that carving helps him stay awake during the early part of the night, when the coals are hottest and the room is drowsiest. He laughs softly and says he often falls asleep mid-carving, the tool still in his hand. Nearby, an older man adjusts a row of small clay vessels on a shelf. Inside are dried roots, ground bark, and fragrant leaves. He uses a pinch of one mixture to scatter across the hearthstones. The aroma blooms instantly, filling the shelter with sweetness that cuts through the earthy air. A peculiar personal memory shared in one brittle letter tells of families using scented mixtures not only for comfort, but also to mark time in the long winter evenings, each scent reminding them of a different season waiting beyond the storm. The older man closes his eyes for a moment, letting the fragrance sink into memory before returning the vessel to its place. The room begins winding down, people adjust their blankets. A girl checks the coals again, nudging them so they will burn long enough for first sleep. The youngest children curl together near the warm stone beneath the quilt, giggling softly before settling. A soft hum drifts from one corner of the room. A woman sings a melody so low it blends naturally with the sound of the fire. Her tune rises and falls like a distant river, smoothing the storm's rough edges. The hum ripples through the shelter, settling on each person like a second blanket. The oldest member of the household clears his throat and mentions something about drifting snow patterns. A brief discussion follows whether the wind's recent shift means the doorway will be buried by morning, or if the sod roof will shed enough snow to keep things manageable. The sparse documentation from similar winter dwellings leaves multiple possibilities regarding how accurately families predicted storm behaviour from inside these earthen homes. Listening to the gentle debate, you sense the conversation isn't about being right. It's about understanding winter well enough to live another day within it. Someone dims the lantern, shadows thicken, gathering softly in the corners. The coals glow with steady orange light, casting quiet maps of warmth across the walls. You feel the sod house settle around you, the soil-packed walls embracing the night's cold like a strong, steady guardian. You lie back on a thick mat close to the hearth. The pocket stone warms your hands. A quilt is draped over your legs. The air feels muted, earthy safe. The storm outside continues its wild dance, but its voice reaches you only as a faint vibration beneath the sod roof. The family's breaths slow around you. The child with the river stone sleeps with it pressed to his cheek. The humming fades to a whisper. Your eyes drift closed. The warmth of the earth rises through you. You feel as though you're sleeping not in a house, but inside the hillside itself. And with the soft glow of coals and the deep hush of earthen walls around you, you slip gently into a night of quiet, grounded rest. You leave the sod house and step once again into a world that feels carved from swirling ice. The storm has grown deeper, more resonant, its voice echoing across the land like some vast drumbeat, repeating itself through the night. You lift your collar and walk into the dark, letting the wind shove you in uneven bursts. Slowly through the chaos of snow and shadow, you begin to see shapes, large mounds rising in soft contours like white domes scattered across the plain. Only when you draw closer do you realize these no-chance formations. They are haystacks frozen into monumental winter sculptures, and tucked among them a makeshift shelter glows with faint lamplight. You hurry toward it, pushing aside a curtain of canvas someone has draped across an opening in the largest hay mound. Warmth spills out in gentle waves, surprising you. Inside, 3 ranch hands sit on overturned buckets around a low lantern. The air carries the soft, grassy scent of hay mixed with the smoky tang of a small ember pot. They greet you with amused nods, as if expecting someone else to wander in from the storm sooner or later. You take a seat near the lantern. The shelter's walls curve inward, thick layers of hay packed tightly and frozen by the storm's breath. The structure feels strangely alive, like a giant animal curled around you. One ranch hand explains they've been using these hay shelters for years. Notes recorded in frontier household books repeatedly emphasize that improvised hay caves provided quick, but surprisingly effective protection during blizzards, especially for ranchers who had to stay near distant livestock. A young man tosses you a blanket and laughs softly when you blink at the warmth radiating through it. He explains that the hay itself traps heat, especially when bodies are close together. You press your shoulder against the wall and feel the warmth stored there, a softness you did not expect from something frozen. In one corner sits a small tin filled with glowing coals. A woman nudges it closer to the group, adjusting the cloth wrapped around its rim, so the heat spreads gently without risk of burning the hay. She tells you the trick is to keep the fire small. Too much heat might dry the wall, and a dry hay wall is a danger none of them want to imagine. A tiny seasonal belief traded quietly between neighbours describes how some ranch families placed a pinch of salt near ember pots in hay shelters to keep the warmth steady and the luck even. You notice a small dish of salt near the coals. The storm outside thunders. Snow presses firmly against the canvas flap, but inside the shelter hums with quiet calm. Someone stirs a pot of warm water and hands you a mug. It tastes faintly of hay and ash, but the heat slips gently through your chest. A lanky ranch hand leans back against the wall and mutters that the cattle tonight must be half buried by drifts. He tells the others they'll dig paths when dawn finally arrives. Another shakes his head and insists the drifting will only worsen by morning. Their disagreement feels familiar-like, weary, inevitable. No firm, scholarly consensus has been reached because of conflicting testimonies about how well frontier ranchers could truly predict blizzard behaviour. Listening to them now, the uncertainty seems to be part of the landscape itself. The woman checks the canvas flap again, pressing her palm to the frozen outer layer. She says the wind has shifted, lowering her voice as though sharing a secret with the hay mound. She listens with care, then returns to her seat. The ranch hands follow her expression, closely trusting her word without question. This tiny shelter built in minutes functions by quiet observation as much as materials. One of the men reaches into the hay near his shoulder and pulls out a small wooden box. Inside is a lump of brown sugar wrapped carefully in cloth. He breaks a piece off and laps it onto his tongue, sighing with contentment. Then he hands you a small sliver. It melts slowly, sending a warm sweetness through your mouth. The woman chuckles and says sugar burns slow energy in the cold, a lesson she learned from someone older than the hills. The youngest of the group curls into his blanket, resting his head on a bundle of twine. He begins to drift towards sleep, but each time the storm shifts, he opens one eye, checking the canvas flap. Habit. He says not fear. He closes his eyes again, sighing deeply. Another man lies on his back, hands behind his head, staring at the dome-shaped ceiling. He remarks softly that hay shelters like this always remind him of summers of warmth, of grass brushing against his skin, of sunlight slanting through tall fields. You feel it too, the smell of hay carries a memory of green warmth, even in the middle of an icy night. The ember pot glows steadily. The shelter flexes slightly with each gust of wind. Shadows tremble across the curved ceiling. You feel the world narrowing into a circle of light and warmth, surrounded by countless blades of hay that hold back the storm. When the lantern is dimmed, the darkness becomes a soft, velvety blanket. Only the ember pot glows now, casting faint red light across tired faces. The ranch hands settle themselves more comfortably. Someone hums a tune barely louder than breath. The shelter creaks softly in response. You lie back against the layered hay, its warmth surprising you again. You feel the breath of your companions easing, deepening, settling. The storm outside loses definition and becomes a broad, distant roar. Your own eyelids sag, your breath slows. The hay around you yields gently to your weight as though encouraging sleep. And in that hidden hollow of warmth tucked deep within a storm that rages without mercy, you drift into a final gentle slumber. Now the journey slows. The storm that roared across the wild west fades into a quiet hum at the edge of your awareness, like a tide pulling gently back into the night. You feel the cold loosen its grip, not because the snow has stopped falling, but because warmth has learned how to gather around you. Every shelter you visited, every quilt, every fire, every whisper of old winter wisdom has settled into a soft circle of comfort. Breathe a little slower now. Let your shoulders ease downward as though laying down the weight of many long miles. The air around you grows warmer, as if the last embers of the hay shelter have followed you here, glowing softly beneath your thoughts. Even the wind seems to move differently, longer, slower, more like a sigh than a shout. You rest at the centre of a stillness spacious enough to hold whole winters. Memories of flickering lanterns drift gently through your mind. Quilts warmed by careful hands, stones pulled from firebeds, breath rising from horses in soft clouds, families gathered in small rooms sharing blankets, stories, and the simple promise of being together through the night. All these moments settle now like warm snow softening every corner of your mind. Your breathing becomes the quiet rhythm of a winter home after midnight. Steady, slow, safe. Outside, the storm grows faint, as though crossing some great distance. Inside, warmth gathers along your spine and settles behind your ribs. There is nothing to brace against now. Nothing to prepare for. Just the gentle drift downward, like lying beneath a thick quilt while the world turns softer around you. Let the night cradle you. Let sleep rise and wrap you in its easy, quiet hands. Everything is calm now. Everything is warm. Sweet dreams.